Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most disturbing death scenes. Picture this: January 28th, 1547, Whitehall Palace. The most powerful man in England is dying, and the smell. Oh God, the smell. Imagine rotting flesh mixed with fear as courtiers hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces while pretending to pray for their king. This isn't just any death. This is the grotesque end of a man who had become so monstrous that even his own physicians were terrified to touch him. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about King Henry VIII's final moments. The truth is far more horrifying than any horror movie Hollywood has ever produced. Before we dive into this dark tale together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up, but only if you're genuinely enjoying the story I'm sharing with you tonight. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Are you tucked in bed, perhaps with a cup of tea, or maybe you're driving home after a long day? Drop a comment and let me know. I genuinely love hearing from you. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a gentle fan for some soothing background noise, and let's embark on this chilling journey together. You know, when most people think of Henry VIII, they picture that famous portrait by Hans Holbein, the one with the broad shoulders, the confident stance, the jeweled cap sitting perfectly on his head. He looks invincible, doesn't he? Like a king who could conquer the world with just a glance. But here's what they don't tell you in history class: that painting was created when Henry was in his mid-40s, still clinging to the image of his younger self. By the time of his death, just over a decade later, he had transformed into something so grotesque that artists refused to paint his true likeness. Let me paint you a different picture, the real Henry of January 1547. Imagine a man so massively obese that it took special machinery just to move him from room to room. We're talking about someone who had ballooned from an athletic 6'2" frame to over 400 pounds of diseased flesh. His leg, which had been wounded in a jousting accident 20 years earlier, had never properly healed. Instead, it had become a festering, putrid wound that oozed constantly and filled entire rooms with the stench of death. But here's the truly terrifying part, and this is where it gets really dark. Henry was still the absolute ruler of England. Every morning, despite being barely able to move, despite the agony that racked his body, he would demand to be lifted from his bed and dressed in his royal robes. Picture servants trying to maneuver this massive, diseased body while pretending everything was normal. They had to act as if their king wasn't literally rotting before their eyes. The courtiers had developed an elaborate system of survival around Henry's condition. They learned to read the subtle signs of his moods through the thickness of the palace walls. When his screams of pain echoed through the corridors, and they did echo, despite the thick tapestries meant to muffle them, everyone knew to stay away. But when there was silence, that was almost worse. Silence could mean he was plotting someone's execution, and he was still executing people. Right up until his final weeks, Henry was signing death warrants. Can you imagine? A man who could barely hold a pen, whose hand shook from pain and illness, was still deciding who lived and who died. In his final year alone, he ordered the executions of over 70 people. Some historians believe the constant pain had driven him completely mad, but I think there's something even more sinister at play here. You see, Henry knew he was dying. The physicians might have been too terrified to tell him directly. After all, suggesting the king was mortal was essentially treason. But Henry wasn't stupid. He could feel his body failing him. He could smell his own decay. And instead of preparing for a peaceful death, instead of seeking redemption for his many crimes, he doubled down on the terror. It's almost as if he wanted to ensure that even in death, he would continue to haunt England, and in a way, he succeeded. The trauma of his reign would echo through generations. His daughter Mary would become known as Bloody Mary for her own reign of terror. His daughter Elizabeth would never marry, perhaps because she had seen firsthand what happened to Henry's wives. His son Edward would die young, possibly from the stress of inheriting such a poisoned legacy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We need to understand how a golden prince, a Renaissance man who once composed music and wrote poetry, became this monster lying in agony at Whitehall Palace. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual descent into darkness that began with small compromises and escalated into mass murder. Each decision Henry made seemed logical at the time, or at least that's what he told himself. When he broke with Rome to divorce Catherine of Aragon, he probably thought it was just politics. When he executed Thomas More for opposing him, he might have convinced himself it was necessary for England's future. But power, especially absolute power, has a way of corrupting even the best intentions. And Henry had never been particularly good at admitting he was wrong. The really chilling part is how normal it all seemed to the people living through it. That's the thing about tyranny, it creeps up on you. One day you're living in a Renaissance kingdom with a charismatic young king, and the next day you're tiptoeing through palace corridors, terrified that a wrong word might be your last. The courtiers who attended Henry in his final days later described an atmosphere of such terror that grown men would wet themselves rather than risk leaving his presence without permission. These were hardened political operators, men who had survived decades in one of the most dangerous courts in Europe, and they were reduced to quivering children by the presence of their dying king. And through it all, Henry maintained his delusions of grandeur. Even as his body betrayed him, even as the smell of his rotting leg made people gag, he still demanded to be treated as the magnificent king he believed himself to be. The cognitive dissonance must have been staggering, both for Henry and for everyone around him. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Henry's final days wasn't his physical condition, or even his continued cruelty. It was his complete inability to see himself as anything other than the hero of his own story. Right up until the end, he believed he'd been a good king, a faithful Christian, a loving father. The man who had executed 2 wives, countless friends, and thousands of subjects saw himself as a victim of circumstance. This is what makes Henry's story so relevant today, actually. We like to think that monsters are obvious, that evil announces itself with dramatic music and villainous monologues. But the truth is, most monsters believe they're the good guys. They rationalize their actions, blame their victims, and convince themselves that their cruelty serves a greater purpose. Henry's final days force us to confront an uncomfortable truth about power and human nature. They show us how a person can become so isolated by their own authority that they lose all connection to reality, all capacity for self-reflection. The smell of death that filled Whitehall Palace in January 1547 wasn't just the stench of Henry's rotting body. It was the smell of a kingdom that had been slowly poisoned by years of absolute power and unchecked cruelty. And as we prepare to delve deeper into this story, you might find yourself wondering, how did it get this bad? How does a golden prince become a bloated beast? The answer lies in a transformation so gradual and yet so complete that it reads like a Gothic horror story. But unlike fiction, this nightmare was all too real, and its effects would ripple through English history for generations to come. So how exactly does a man transform from a golden god into a grotesque monster? The answer might shock you more than you expect. Let me take you back to 1491. When Henry Tudor was born into a world that seemed designed just for him. Picture this, a baby prince who would grow up to be 6 feet 2 inches tall, in an age when the average man barely reached 5'6". We're talking about someone who, by the time he turned 18, could literally look down on almost every person in his kingdom. But it wasn't just his height that made him extraordinary. Young Henry was what we might call today a Renaissance superhero. At age 10, he could already speak fluent Latin, French, and Spanish. By 15, he was composing his own music, and we're not talking about simple melodies, but complex pieces that impressed even the most sophisticated courtiers. He could write poetry that made grown women swoon, play multiple musical instruments, and dance with a grace that would make modern ballet dancers jealous. But here's where it gets really interesting. Henry was also an absolute physical specimen. Contemporary accounts describe him as having shoulders so broad they filled doorways, legs so muscular from hours of riding and swordplay that his silk stockings strained to contain them. When he walked into a room, conversation stopped, not because people were afraid, not yet, but because they were genuinely awestruck. Can you imagine being that person? Having literally every physical and intellectual gift that nature could bestow? It's almost impossible for us to comprehend what that kind of existence would feel like. From the moment Henry could walk, everyone around him reinforced the idea that he was special, chosen, practically divine. And for the first part of his reign, it really seemed like maybe they were right. When Henry became king at 17, after his older brother Arthur died unexpectedly, it was like a fairy tale come to life. Here was this young, handsome, brilliant king who seemed destined to usher in a golden age for England. The contrast with his predecessor couldn't have been more stark. His father, Henry VII, had been calculating, paranoid, penny-pinching. He'd ruled through fear and careful diplomacy, always looking over his shoulder for the next challenger to his throne. But young Henry VIII, he ruled through charisma and confidence. Where his father had hoarded gold, Henry threw magnificent parties. Where his father had avoided foreign entanglements, Henry dreamed of conquering France. The early years of Henry's reign read like a Renaissance romance novel. In 1509, just weeks after becoming king, he married Catherine of Aragon, who had been his brother's widow. Now this should have been a purely political marriage. That's how royal marriages worked back then. But something magical happened. Henry and Catherine actually fell in love. Contemporary accounts describe them as inseparable. They would hunt together, dance together, attend mass together. Henry would write her love letters in Latin, and she would respond with poetry in Spanish. They seemed to represent everything beautiful about the Renaissance, the perfect union of physical beauty, intellectual brilliance, and genuine affection. But here's the first hint of the darkness to come, and it's so subtle you might miss it. Henry was already showing signs of what we might call today narcissistic behavior patterns. He didn't just want to be loved by Catherine, he needed to be worshipped by everyone. The court festivals weren't just celebrations, they were elaborate productions designed to showcase Henry's magnificence. Take the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520, for example. Henry arranged to meet the French King Francis I between Calais and Boulogne for what was supposed to be a diplomatic summit. But Henry turned it into the most expensive party in European history. We're talking about temporary palaces built just for a 3-week event, with actual gold thread woven into the tents, hence the name. The cost was so astronomical that it nearly bankrupted the English treasury. But here's what's really telling. Henry didn't just want to impress Francis III, he needed to outshine him. Contemporary accounts describe Henry becoming visibly agitated whenever Francis received more applause or attention than he did. At one point, Henry challenged Francis to a wrestling match, and when Francis won, Henry's mood turned so dark that his advisors feared he might declare war on the spot. This is where we start to see the psychological cracks in Henry's golden facade. Success wasn't enough. He needed total domination. Love wasn't enough. He required absolute worship. And when reality didn't match his self-image, well, that's when things started to get dangerous. The transformation accelerated after Henry's first major public humiliation. In 1525, he was captured during a battle with the French. Not physically captured, mind you, but politically outmaneuvered so thoroughly that he was forced to sign a treaty that made him look weak. For someone who had spent his entire life being told he was invincible, this was devastating. Friends who knew Henry before and after this period described a noticeable change. The easy laughter became rarer. The generous spirit turned calculating. He started seeing enemies where once he had seen friends, threats where once he had seen opportunities. But the real catalyst for Henry's transformation into a monster wasn't military defeat or political setback. It was something much more personal and much more painful. His growing obsession with producing a male heir. By 1525, Henry and Catherine had been married for 16 years, and while Catherine had been pregnant multiple times, they had only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. In an age when infant mortality was common, this might have been considered fortunate. But for Henry, it felt like divine punishment. You have to understand the mindset of the time. Kings didn't just rule by political authority, they ruled by what they believed was divine right. God had chosen them to be kings, and God would provide them with sons to continue their dynasty. For Henry, Catherine's inability to produce a male heir wasn't just a personal disappointment, it was a cosmic rejection. This is where Henry's narcissism became truly dangerous. Instead of accepting that sometimes tragedy strikes even kings, instead of finding meaning in the daughter they did have, Henry convinced himself that God was punishing him for some unknown sin, and if God was punishing him, then clearly he needed to fix whatever was wrong. The physical transformation began around this time as well. Court records show that by 1530, Henry's armour had to be let out significantly. The man who had once been lean and athletic was developing what we might politely call a royal paunch. But it wasn't just overeating, though Henry's appetite had become legendary. The real culprit was a much more serious problem. In 1536, during a jousting tournament, Henry suffered what modern doctors believe was a severe traumatic brain injury. He was thrown from his horse and lay unconscious for 2 hours, which, in the 16th century, was often a death sentence. When he finally woke up, those close to him noticed immediate changes in his personality. The headaches started almost immediately. Violent, debilitating headaches that would last for days and leave Henry barely able to function. His temper, which had always been quick, became explosive. His suspicion of others, which had been growing gradually, became paranoid and irrational. But perhaps most significantly, his relationship with food changed dramatically. Before the accident, Henry had been an active man who could eat heartily without consequence. Afterward, even as his activity level decreased due to the chronic pain from his injuries, his appetite seemed to increase exponentially. Modern medical experts who have studied Henry's case believe he developed what we now call binge eating disorder, possibly triggered by the brain injury and compounded by the chronic pain he was experiencing. Within just 5 years of the accident, Henry had gained over 100 pounds. Picture this transformation. The Golden Prince who once danced until dawn now struggled to climb a flight of stairs. The athlete who could joust for hours could barely walk across a room without becoming winded. The man who'd been the physical embodiment of royal power was becoming a prisoner in his own increasingly massive body. And as his body failed him, his mind became even more dangerous. The headaches, the constant pain, the humiliation of his physical limitations, All of it fed into a growing rage that would soon consume not just Henry, but everyone around him. But even as we watch this tragic transformation unfold, we have to remember that Henry still possessed that brilliant mind and charismatic personality that had made him so magnetic in his youth. He didn't become stupid or obviously mad. Instead, he became something much more dangerous. A highly intelligent narcissist with unlimited power and a growing list of grudges against the world. The most chilling part: Henry himself couldn't see what he was becoming. In his mind, he was still that golden prince, still that chosen king, still that Renaissance hero. Everyone else was the problem. Everyone else was failing him. Everyone else deserved whatever punishment he decided to inflict. And as we're about to discover, Henry's first target for this growing rage would be someone who had loved him faithfully for over 20 years, someone who had supported him through every trial and triumph, someone who had no way of knowing that the man she had fallen in love with was slowly dying, and that something much darker was taking his place. What happened next would become one of the most gruesome medical mysteries in royal history, a wound that would literally rule an empire for 20 years. January 24th, 1536. Greenwich Palace. Henry is 34 years old, still clinging to his image as England's greatest athlete. The jousting tournament that day was supposed to be a celebration, a chance for the king to show off his skills in front of the French ambassador. Instead, it became the beginning of the end. Picture the scene. Henry, encased in custom-made armor that now weighs over 60 pounds, significantly heavier than his earlier suits, thundering down the list on his massive warhorse. His opponent, Henry Norris, is charging from the other end. The crowd is cheering, anticipating another display of their king's legendary prowess. But something goes wrong, horribly wrong. Henry's horse, a 17-hand destrier weighing nearly 2,000 pounds, stumbles and falls. Henry, still trapped in his heavy armor, goes down with the beast. The horse lands directly on top of him, crushing his left leg and driving the metal plates of his armor deep into his flesh. For 2 hours, 2 entire hours, Henry lies unconscious. In the 16th century, this was basically a death sentence. His courtiers are convinced they're witnessing the end of the Tudor dynasty. Catherine of Aragon is summoned to what everyone believes will be her husband's deathbed, but Henry wakes up, and initially it seems like maybe, just maybe, he's gotten away with it. The leg is badly bruised, certainly, but it doesn't appear to be broken. The royal physicians, led by Dr. William Butts, examine the wound and declare it not mortal. Within weeks, Henry is back on his feet, apparently recovered. Here's where the story takes a truly sinister turn. What nobody realized at the time was that the accident had caused 2 devastating injuries that would plague Henry for the rest of his life. The first was that traumatic brain injury we discussed earlier. The second was what modern doctors believe was a severe case of osteomyelitis, a bone infection that would never ever heal. Now you might be wondering, how could a simple leg wound become so significant? Well, let me paint you a picture of 16th century medicine that might make your stomach turn. The royal physicians had no understanding of antiseptic techniques. When they treated Henry's wound, they used methods that would horrify modern doctors. They would pack the wound with cloth soaked in wine, which, to be fair, had some antibacterial properties. But they would leave these dressings in place for days at a time. They had no concept of sterile instruments. They would probe the wound with the same tools they used for other patients, spreading infection rather than preventing it. But here's the truly grotesque part. They actually believed that pus was a good thing. The medical theory of the time held that laudable pus, basically infected discharge, was a sign that the body was healing itself. So when Henry's wound began producing thick yellowish fluid that smelled like rotting meat, His doctors were pleased. They were essentially encouraging the infection that would torture him for the next 20 years. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Henry had always prided himself on his physical perfection. Now suddenly, he had this constant reminder of his mortality literally rotting away inside his leg. The pain was excruciating. Imagine having a severe toothache, but in your leg, every single day for 20 years. But the smell. Oh, the smell was perhaps the worst part. Contemporary accounts describe a stench so powerful that it could be detected from several rooms away. Courtiers learned to position themselves upwind of the king during audiences. The royal apartments had to be constantly fumigated with burning herbs and perfumes, but nothing could completely mask the odor of decay. Henry became obsessed with hiding his condition. He commissioned special boots designed to conceal the swelling in his leg. He had his doublets tailored with extra padding to disguise his increasingly corpulent figure. But most tellingly, he began wearing perfumes so strong that they made people's eyes water. Anything to mask the smell of his rotting flesh. The daily routine of treating the wound became a ritual of horror that Henry would endure for 2 decades. Every morning, his personal physicians would arrive to change the dressings. The old cloths, soaked with pus and blood, would be carefully removed and burned immediately, not for sanitary reasons, but to prevent anyone from using them in witchcraft against the king. Fresh dressings would be applied, often soaked in various concoctions that the doctors hoped might help. Wine, honey, ground pearls, even powdered unicorn horn. Yes, they actually believed that was a real medicine. The entire process would take over an hour and leave Henry sweating with pain and humiliation. But here's what makes this story even more tragic. The wound could have been healed, or at least significantly improved, with proper medical care. Modern analysis of Henry's symptoms suggests that aggressive surgical debridement, essentially cutting away all the infected tissue, might have saved him. But 16th century medicine was terrified of such radical procedures, especially when the patient was the king. Instead, they chose the conservative approach. Keep the wound open, let it drain, and hope for the best. What they didn't understand was that by keeping the wound open, they were allowing bacteria to continuously reinfect the damaged tissue. Henry's leg became a permanent breeding ground for infection. The impact on his personality was swift and severe. Friends who knew Henry before the accident described him as having a quick temper, but also a quick forgiveness. After 1536, the forgiveness disappeared entirely, but the temper became volcanic. The constant pain made him irritable and unpredictable. Courtiers never knew whether they would encounter the charming Renaissance prince or a rage-filled tyrant. More disturbing still, Henry began to see his injury as divine punishment, but not for anything he had done wrong. Instead, he convinced himself that God was testing him, and that anyone who failed to support him completely was part of that test. This twisted logic would soon justify the most horrific acts of his reign. The leg wound also triggered a cascade of other health problems. The constant pain made sleep difficult, so Henry became dependent on various remedies that we would now recognize as primitive painkillers. Some contained opium, which likely contributed to his increasingly erratic behavior. Others contained mercury, which may have caused additional neurological damage. His eating habits became even more compulsive. Food, particularly rich sweet foods, seemed to provide temporary relief from the pain. Royal accounts show that Henry's consumption of sugar increased dramatically after 1536. He would consume entire platters of sweetmeats during a single sitting, washing them down with heavily spiced wine that was probably intended to dull his pain. The weight gain accelerated rapidly. By 1540, just 4 years after the accident, Henry's armour had to be completely redesigned. His chest measurement had increased from 42 inches to over 50 inches. His waist, once trim at 32 inches, had expanded to 44 inches and was still growing. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Henry's condition was how it affected his relationship with death. Before the accident, death had been an abstract concept for Henry, something that happened to other people, something he was too young and too strong to worry about. After the accident, death became his constant companion. Every morning when he woke up, Henry could smell his own decay. Every step reminded him that his body was failing him. Every time he looked in a mirror, he saw the shadow of the golden prince he had once been. This intimate relationship with mortality didn't make him more compassionate or philosophical. Instead, it made him desperate to prove that he was still the powerful, virile king he had always been. And how does a king prove his power when his body is betraying him? By exercising the one form of strength that doesn't require physical prowess, the power of life and death over his subjects. The leg wound didn't just change Henry's body, it changed his entire approach to kingship. The generous, charismatic ruler began to give way to something much darker. A king who would use terror as a substitute for the physical dominance he could no longer command. But even as the infection spread through his leg, even as the pain wore away at his sanity, Henry maintained the fiction that he was still that magnificent Renaissance prince. He would sit in audiences with his rotting leg elevated on a specially designed stool covered by rich fabrics that couldn't quite hide the smell, and demand that everyone pretend nothing had changed. The courtiers, of course, had no choice but to play along. They learned to breathe through their mouths during royal audiences. They developed elaborate codes to warn each other about the king's mood, based on how badly his leg was bothering him on any given day. They lived in a world where acknowledging reality could literally cost them their heads, and as we're about to see, this toxic combination of physical agony, psychological trauma, and unlimited power would soon claim its first royal victim. Someone who had stood by Henry through every trial, someone who had never imagined that love and loyalty might not be enough to save her from the monster her husband was becoming. The pattern was already set, but nobody could see it yet. Henry's transformation from golden prince to monster would claim 6 wives, and the psychological profile of each marriage reveals exactly how a serial killer's mind works. Think about this for a moment. What kind of man marries 6 times? And I'm not talking about someone who's unlucky in love or simply can't find the right person. I'm talking about someone who systematically destroys the women who love him, each time believing he's justified, each time convinced that this time will be different. Let's start with Catherine of Aragon, because her story isn't just about a failed marriage. It's about the birth of a monster. By 1527, Catherine had been Henry's wife for 18 years. 18 years of what, by all accounts, had been genuine love and partnership. She had supported him through political crises, celebrated his victories, comforted him during his defeats. When Henry suffered that devastating jousting accident, Catherine was the first person called to his bedside. She had been his anchor, his closest advisor, his most trusted ally. But Catherine had committed the unforgivable sin. She had failed to give Henry a son. Now, here's where it gets psychologically fascinating and deeply disturbing. A normal person, faced with 18 years of marriage to a loving, faithful partner, might feel sadness about their childlessness. They might seek medical advice, turn to prayer, or simply accept that some things are beyond human control. But Henry decided that Catherine had personally betrayed him. The logic he used would become a template for every relationship disaster that followed. First, he convinced himself that the problem couldn't possibly be his fault. After all, he was the king chosen by God, the golden prince who had never failed at anything. Second, he decided that if the marriage wasn't producing the results he wanted, then the marriage itself must be cursed, invalid, wrong from the beginning. The psychological gymnastics Henry performed to justify abandoning Catherine are truly breathtaking. He suddenly discovered that marrying his brother's widow had been sinful all along. Never mind that he'd needed special papal dispensation to marry Catherine in the first place. Never mind that some of the greatest theologians in Europe had approved the union. Henry had decided that God was punishing him, and Catherine was the instrument of that punishment. But here's what makes Henry's treatment of Catherine so chilling. He didn't just want to divorce her. He wanted to destroy her entirely, to erase her from history, to make it as if their 18 years together had never happened. The campaign of psychological torture that Henry unleashed on Catherine between 1527 and 1533 reads like a textbook example of domestic abuse. First, he isolated her from her supporters, sending away her Spanish ladies-in-waiting and replacing them with women loyal to his new obsession, Anne Boleyn. Then he began gaslighting her, insisting that their marriage had never been valid, that she'd never really been queen, that their daughter Mary was illegitimate. Catherine fought back with a dignity that must have infuriated Henry. When he demanded that she accept the annulment and retire to a convent, she refused. When he stripped her of her title and insisted she be called the Dowager Princess of Wales, referring to her brief marriage to his deceased brother, she continued signing her letters as Catherine the Queen. The final confrontation between Henry and Catherine took place at Blackfriars in 1529, during the public hearing of their divorce case. Picture this scene. Catherine, now in her 40s but still regal, approaches Henry's throne and falls to her knees before him. In front of the entire court, she makes one last desperate plea. "Sir," she said, "I beseech you for all the love that hath been between us, and for the love of God, let me have justice. Take of me some pity and compassion, for I am a poor woman and a stranger born out of your dominion." The words are heartbreaking enough, but it's what happened next that reveals the true depth of Henry's transformation. Catherine continued, "I have been to you a true, humble, and obedient wife, ever conformable to your will and pleasure. And when ye had me at the first, I take God to be my judge, I was a true maid, without touch of man." Any normal husband, hearing those words from a woman who had loved him faithfully for 18 years, might have felt at least a moment of doubt, a flicker of compassion. Henry felt nothing. Worse than nothing. He felt irritated that Catherine was making a scene, embarrassed that she was publicly challenging his narrative. When Catherine finished speaking and waited for Henry's response, he simply sat there in silence. Then, when she realized he wasn't going to answer, she rose to her feet, curtsied to him one final time, and walked out of the court. It was the last time they would ever see each other, but Henry wasn't finished with his psychological warfare. Over the next 4 years, he systematically stripped Catherine of everything that had given her life meaning. She was forbidden from seeing their daughter Mary. She was exiled to increasingly remote and uncomfortable castles. Her household was reduced from hundreds of servants to just a handful. Her letters were intercepted and censored. Most cruelly of all, Henry began spreading rumours that Catherine was mentally unstable, that her refusal to accept the annulment proved she was unfit to have ever been queen. He enlisted physicians to testify that her inability to produce sons was evidence of some physical defect that made her unworthy of royal marriage. The pattern was being established. When Henry decided a woman had failed him, she didn't just lose his love, she lost her identity, her dignity, her very right to exist in his world. Catherine died in 1536, just a few months after Henry's jousting accident, alone in a cold castle with only 3 servants. The official cause of death was listed as cancer of the heart, which isn't even a real medical condition. Modern historians suspect she was slowly poisoned, possibly with arsenic, which would have caused the symptoms described by her final attendants. On her deathbed, Catherine still signed her last letter as Catherine the Queen. Even dying alone and forgotten, she refused to let Henry rewrite their history. But here's the truly chilling part. Henry felt no remorse about Catherine's death. When news reached him that his first wife had died, his reaction was to throw a party. He appeared at court the next day dressed entirely in yellow, whether in celebration or because yellow was the Spanish colour of mourning, and he was mocking Catherine's heritage, we'll never know. What we do know is that this was the moment Henry crossed a line he could never uncross. He had successfully destroyed a woman who had loved him faithfully for nearly 2 decades, and instead of feeling guilt or sorrow, he felt nothing. Or perhaps worse, he felt vindicated. The psychological profile was complete. Henry had learned that he could justify any cruelty by convincing himself that his victims had somehow betrayed him first. He had discovered that his power as king meant he could rewrite reality itself, making his victims into villains and himself into the wronged party. And waiting in the wings was Anne Boleyn, the woman who had helped him destroy Catherine, who had supported his every cruel decision, who had celebrated Catherine's exile and humiliation. Anne, who was about to discover that being Henry's accomplice in one wife's destruction didn't protect you from becoming his next victim. You see, Anne had made a fatal error in judgment. She had assumed that because Henry had moved heaven and earth to marry her, because he had broken with Rome and risked civil war for her sake, she was somehow special, somehow different from Catherine. She thought she understood Henry's psychology. She had no idea that she had just witnessed a dress rehearsal for her own destruction. Henry had learned exactly how to destroy a wife who disappointed him, and now he had a taste for it. The Golden Prince was gone forever, replaced by something far more dangerous. A king who had discovered that murder could be disguised as justice, and that absolute power meant never having to admit you were wrong. What Anne Boleyn was about to learn, in the most horrific way possible, was that Henry's capacity for self-deception was matched only by his genius for cruelty. And when those two forces combined with the unlimited power of Tudor kingship, the result would be a reign of terror that would make his treatment of Catherine look almost merciful. Now comes the most terrifying period in English history, when Henry discovered that paranoia combined with absolute power creates the perfect recipe for mass murder. The numbers alone should shock you. In his final decade, from 1537 to 1547, Henry VIII ordered the execution of over 70,000 people. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 9 people executed every single day for 10 years straight. We're talking about a systematic reign of terror that would make Stalin proud. But here's what makes Henry's mass-killing spree even more chilling. It wasn't random violence or the product of a complete mental breakdown. It was calculated, methodical, and in Henry's twisted mind, completely justified. This was paranoia with a purpose, and that purpose was maintaining absolute control through absolute fear. The transformation into a paranoid killer began almost immediately after his accident in 1536. The brain injury, the constant pain, the humiliation of his failing body, all of it fed into a growing conviction that everyone around him was plotting against him. And when you're a king with unlimited power and a rotting leg that reminds you of your mortality every waking moment, paranoia becomes a very dangerous thing indeed. Let me paint you a picture of what daily life was like at Henry's court during this period. Imagine walking into a room where everyone is terrified to speak above a whisper. where a misplaced word or an unfortunate facial expression could literally cost you your life. Courtiers developed an elaborate system of survival techniques. They would practice their facial expressions in mirrors to ensure they never accidentally showed the wrong emotion in the king's presence. The Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapuis wrote in 1538 that the very air of England has become poisoned with fear. He described seeing grown men, powerful nobles who commanded armies and vast estates, literally trembling when summoned to appear before Henry. These weren't weak or cowardly people. These were the same courtiers who had once laughed and joked with the Golden Prince. Now they lived in constant terror that their next conversation with the king might be their last. But Henry's paranoia wasn't just about imaginary threats. The chronic pain from his leg wound had made sleep nearly impossible, and sleep deprivation, combined with his possible opium use for pain relief, created a perfect storm of psychological instability. Modern sleep researchers have shown that chronic insomnia can cause hallucinations, delusions, and severe paranoid thinking, exactly the symptoms Henry began displaying. The killing spree that defined Henry's final years began with a single execution that revealed just how far he had fallen. In June 1540, Henry ordered the execution of Thomas Cromwell, the man who had been his closest advisor for nearly a decade. Cromwell had been instrumental in Henry's break with Rome, had helped engineer the destruction of Catherine of Aragon, had supported every cruel decision Henry had made. But Cromwell had made one fatal error. He had arranged Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, the German princess who famously failed to live up to her flattering portrait. When Henry met Anne in person and found her less attractive than he had expected, he didn't blame the artist or the political circumstances that had made the marriage necessary. He blamed Cromwell. The speed of Cromwell's fall from grace was breathtaking. One day he was Henry's most trusted minister. 3 weeks later he was dead. No trial, no chance to defend himself, no consideration of his years of loyal service. Henry simply decided that Cromwell had betrayed him, and that was enough. What's truly chilling about Cromwell's execution is how casually Henry ordered it. Contemporary accounts describe him discussing Cromwell's death warrant over dinner, as if he were commenting on the weather. The man who had once agonized over difficult political decisions now signed death sentences with the same casual ease as he might sign a tax authorization. But Cromwell's execution was just the beginning. Once Henry had crossed the line from executing obvious enemies to killing loyal servants, the floodgates were open. Anyone could become a threat. Anyone could be accused of treason. Anyone could find themselves facing the executioner's axe based on nothing more than Henry's paranoid suspicions. The Exeter conspiracy of 1538 shows just how twisted Henry's logic had become. The Marquis of Exeter, Henry Courtenay, was Henry's own cousin. They'd grown up together, played together as children, served together in their youth. But Courtenay had the misfortune of being descended from Edward IV, which meant he had a distant claim to the throne. In Henry's increasingly paranoid mind, this distant royal blood made Courtenay an automatic threat. It didn't matter that Courtenay had never shown any ambition for the crown, had never plotted against Henry, had been consistently loyal for over 30 years. The mere existence of his bloodline was enough to justify his death. The evidence against Courtenay was laughably thin. Some private conversations where he had allegedly criticised Henry's policies, a few letters that could be interpreted as disloyal if you squinted hard enough. In any rational legal system, these charges would have been dismissed immediately. But Henry's England was no longer a rational place. Courtenay was executed along with his eldest son, effectively wiping out an entire branch of the royal family. Henry's own cousin killed for the crime of existing with the wrong bloodline, and Henry slept peacefully that night, convinced he had eliminated a dangerous traitor. The psychological mechanism Henry used to justify these murders is fascinating and terrifying. He had developed what psychologists now call malignant narcissism, a condition where the person becomes incapable of admitting fault or accepting responsibility for negative outcomes. Every problem in Henry's life had to be someone else's fault, and eliminating that someone would supposedly solve the problem. Can't produce a male heir with Catherine. Catherine must be cursed. Eliminate her. Marriage to Anne of Cleves is embarrassing. Cromwell must have sabotaged it. Eliminate him. Nobles have royal blood that makes you feel insecure. They must be plotting. Eliminate them. This twisted logic extended to every aspect of Henry's rule. When the English economy struggled under the massive costs of his wars and extravagant lifestyle, Henry didn't reduce spending or reconsider his policies. Instead, he executed merchants and nobles he blamed for economic problems. When religious reforms caused social unrest, he didn't moderate his approach. He executed anyone who complained. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1556 perfectly illustrates Henry's paranoid cruelty. This was a popular uprising in northern England, where common people protested the destruction of monasteries and the religious changes Henry had imposed. These weren't foreign enemies or scheming nobles. These were Henry's own subjects, expressing legitimate grievances about policies that were destroying their communities. A secure, confident king might have listened to these concerns, perhaps made some compromises to address the protesters' legitimate complaints. Henry's response was to promise pardons to anyone who returned home peacefully, and then, once the rebellion was over and the protesters had dispersed, he systematically hunted down and executed over 200 of the uprising's leaders. The betrayal was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. Men who had trusted Henry's word, who had believed in royal mercy, found themselves facing the gallows. Entire families were destroyed. Communities that had existed for centuries were left leaderless and traumatized. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Henry's reign of terror was how thoroughly he convinced himself that he was the victim in all of this. In his correspondence from this period, Henry consistently portrays himself as a long-suffering king, constantly betrayed by ungrateful subjects who refuse to appreciate his benevolent rule. In a letter to the French ambassador in 1541, Henry actually complained about the burden of having to execute so many people. He wrote that it grieved his tender heart to be forced to take such harsh measures, but that the treachery of his subjects left him no choice. The man who was systematically murdering anyone who disagreed with him genuinely believed he was the wronged party. The paranoia had become so all-consuming that Henry began seeing threats in the most innocent activities. Playing cards with the wrong people could be interpreted as conspiracy. Reading the wrong books could be evidence of treason. Even facial expressions became dangerous. One courtier was imprisoned for 3 months because Henry thought he had smirked at an inappropriate moment during a royal ceremony. But Henry's paranoia wasn't just destroying individual lives, it was poisoning the entire fabric of English society. Trust, which is the foundation of any functional government, had completely broken down. Nobles stopped confiding in their friends. Servants reported on their masters. Families turned against each other, terrified that association with the wrong person might be fatal. The atmosphere of terror was so pervasive that it began affecting Henry's own family. His daughter Mary, now in her 20s, lived in constant fear that her father might decide she was a threat to his new family with Jane Seymour. His daughter Elizabeth, still a young child, was already learning to hide her thoughts and feelings, instinctively understanding that honesty could be dangerous in her father's presence. And through it all, Henry maintained the fiction that he was a benevolent Christian king guided by divine wisdom and acting only in England's best interests. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. A mass murderer who genuinely believed he was a loving father to his people. As we're about to see, this toxic combination of paranoia, pain, and unchecked power would soon create the most oppressive surveillance state in English history, a kingdom where even the king's own palaces would become prisons, and where the smell of death would literally permeate the air that everyone breathed. By 1540, Henry's palaces had become something unimaginable, beautiful architectural masterpieces that reeked of death, decay, and constant terror. Welcome to the most horrifying royal court in European history. Imagine walking through the gates of Hampton Court Palace in those final years. From the outside it still looked magnificent, red brick towers soaring into the sky, elaborate chimneys decorated with the finest stonework, gardens that stretched as far as the eye could see. But the moment you crossed the threshold, you would have been hit by a wall of stench so powerful it would make your eyes water. The smell came from multiple sources, and none of them were pleasant. First, there was Henry himself, that constantly festering leg wound we discussed, now so putrid that it could be detected from 3 rooms away. The royal physicians had tried everything, burning herbs, scattering rose petals, even hanging pomanders soaked in the strongest perfumes available. Nothing worked. But Henry's rotting flesh was just the beginning. The atmosphere of terror that permeated the court had created a situation where basic hygiene and maintenance were breaking down. Servants were too terrified of making mistakes to properly clean the chambers. Food was left to spoil rather than risk disturbing the king's rest. Chamber pots went unemptied because no one wanted to risk entering areas where they might accidentally encounter Henry in a bad mood. The result was a palace that looked like a fairy tale from the outside but felt like a plague house from within. Foreign ambassadors began requesting meetings in the gardens whenever possible, claiming that English air inside the buildings was too thick to breathe comfortably. Have you ever been in a place where you could literally smell the fear? That's what Henry's court had become. The human body produces specific chemical compounds when it's under extreme stress, and when you have hundreds of people living in constant terror, those compounds create a distinct sickly odour that mingles with everything else. But the physical smell was nothing compared to the psychological atmosphere. Picture this. Every morning, courtiers would gather in the great halls dressed in their finest clothes, trying to look normal while their hands shook with nervousness. Conversations were conducted in whispers, and even then people were careful to speak only about the most innocuous subjects. The elaborate rituals of court life continued, but they had taken on a nightmarish quality. The formal presentations to the king, which had once been opportunities for nobles to showcase their wit and charm, became exercises in survival. Everyone knew that a poorly chosen word, an unfortunate gesture, even an unlucky facial expression could result in a trip to the Tower of London. Lord Edmund Howard, a cousin of the king, wrote in his private diary about the daily horror of court attendance. He described watching grown men practice their bows in private chambers, rehearsing exactly what they would say to Henry, planning their escape routes in case the audience went badly. Howard himself admitted to carrying a small vial of poison, preferring the possibility of a quick death to the slow agony of Henry's displeasure. The king's daily routine had become a carefully choreographed dance around his deteriorating condition. Each morning a team of 6 servants would arrive to help move Henry from his bed, not because he was incapacitated, but because his massive weight combined with the pain in his leg made independent movement nearly impossible. The process of dressing the king took over 2 hours and required specialized equipment. Henry's doublets were now reinforced with whalebone stays to support his enormous bulk. His boots were custom-made with hidden lifts and padding to accommodate the swelling in his infected leg. Most grotesquely, his clothing was designed with hidden pockets for the constantly changed bandages that were needed to contain the discharge from his wound. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of court life was how everyone was forced to pretend that nothing had changed. The fiction that Henry was still the magnificent Renaissance prince had to be maintained at all costs. Courtiers would compliment his appearance even as they secretly held perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses. They would praise his wisdom and strength even as they watched him struggle to walk across a room. The entertainment at court had taken on a bizarre, almost surreal quality. Henry still demanded music and dancing, but the performances had to be carefully calibrated to his unpredictable moods. Musicians learned to watch Henry's face constantly, ready to switch from a lively tune to something more sombre if they detected signs of irritation or pain. The court jesters faced perhaps the most impossible task of all. Comedy, by its very nature, often involves poking fun at authority or highlighting uncomfortable truths. But how do you make jokes when your audience might order your execution for saying the wrong thing? The surviving records of Will Sommers, Henry's most famous fool, show a man walking an impossibly thin line between entertainment and suicide. Meal times had become elaborate productions designed to disguise the king's grotesque eating habits. Henry's appetite had become truly monstrous. Royal kitchen records show that he was consuming enough food for 6 normal people at every sitting. But it wasn't just the quantity that was disturbing, it was the manner of his eating. The constant pain made Henry irritable and impatient, so he would often grab food with his hands, tearing at meat like a wild animal. Table manners, which had once been a mark of noble breeding, were abandoned in favour of simply getting food into his mouth as quickly as possible. Courtiers learned to look away during meals, pretending to be fascinated by the tapestries on the walls, while their king devoured his dinner like a beast. The sleeping arrangements at the palace had also become a source of horror. Henry's bedchamber was constantly attended by physicians and servants, not because he needed medical care, but because he was terrified of dying alone. The room reeked of medicinal herbs, bodily fluids, and the ever-present stench of his infected leg. But the king's insomnia meant that the entire palace lived on his schedule. Henry would often be awake and restless at 3 a.m, demanding entertainment or company. Courtiers learned to sleep in their clothes, ready to be summoned at any hour to play cards, listen to music, or simply sit in terrified silence while Henry ranted about his various grievances. The servants who attended Henry most closely lived in a state of constant psychological trauma. They were required to help change his bandages, clean his wounds, and assist with his most basic bodily functions, but they were also required to maintain the pretense that they were serving a magnificent king rather than a diseased paranoid invalid. One particularly horrifying account comes from Hugh Dennis, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, who described the daily ritual of helping Henry dress. According to Dennis, the smell of Henry's rotting leg was so overpowering that several servants would regularly vomit during the process, but showing any sign of disgust or revulsion was considered a form of treason, an insult to the royal person that could result in imprisonment or death. The psychological pressure was so intense that several courtiers suffered what we would now recognise as nervous breakdowns. Sir Thomas Wyatt, the poet, wrote extensively about his experiences at court, describing feelings of nausea, sleeplessness, and constant anxiety that plagued him for years after leaving Henry's service. Even more disturbing was how the atmosphere of terror affected the relationships between courtiers. Trust, friendship, and loyalty, the bonds that normally hold a community together, had been completely destroyed by fear. People who had known each other for decades stopped confiding in one another, terrified that a private complaint might be reported to the king. The court had developed an elaborate system of informants and spies. Henry actively encouraged courtiers to report on each other, offering rewards for information about disloyalty or criticism. This created a paranoid atmosphere where everyone was suspicious of everyone else, where casual conversations could be deadly, where even married couples were careful about what they said in private. The children who lived at court during this period were perhaps the most tragic victims of this atmosphere. Young nobles who were sent to serve as pages or ladies-in-waiting learned to suppress their natural curiosity and spontaneity, understanding instinctively that childhood innocence was a luxury they couldn't afford. Many of them would carry psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Princess Elizabeth, Henry's own daughter, was already showing signs of the hypervigilance and emotional control that would define her later reign as queen. Even as a young child, she had learned to watch her father's moods carefully, to speak only when spoken to hide any thoughts or feelings that might be interpreted as criticism. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of court life was how normal it had all become to the people living through it. Human beings have a remarkable capacity to adapt to even the most horrifying circumstances, and Henry's courtiers had learned to function in an environment that should have been unbearable. They developed coping mechanisms, survival strategies, ways of protecting their sanity while navigating the daily nightmare of serving a king who had become a monster. Some turned to drink, others to prayer, still others to the kind of gallows humour that develops in desperate situations. And through it all, Henry maintained his conviction that he was a beloved ruler surrounded by devoted subjects. The isolation of absolute power had become so complete that he genuinely couldn't see the terror and revulsion he inspired in everyone around him. In his mind, the fearful whispers were signs of respect. The careful deference was evidence of love. The desperate attempts to please him were proof of his magnificence. As we're about to discover, this toxic atmosphere of fear and decay was about to produce Henry's most catastrophic decision yet, a final will and testament that would reveal just how completely his mind had been poisoned by years of unchecked power and untreated mental illness. Even on his deathbed, Henry's final act of spite would plunge England into decades of religious warfare and civil chaos. The will he crafted in his dying days reveals the mind of a man so consumed with ego that he was willing to destroy his own kingdom rather than admit he had been wrong. December 30th, 1546. Henry knows he's dying, though no one dares speak the words aloud. His body is shutting down, his mind is clouded by pain and medication, but his obsession with control burns as fiercely as ever. In what should be his final opportunity to ensure England's stability, Henry instead chooses to engineer the most catastrophic succession crisis in English history. Think about this for a moment. What kind of father knowingly sets up his children to destroy each other? What kind of king deliberately creates conditions that will tear his kingdom apart? The answers lie in Henry's twisted final will, a document so vindictive and self-serving that it reads like the revenge fantasy of a dying sociopath. Let's start with the most shocking revelation. Henry's will completely ignores the laws of primogeniture that had governed English succession for centuries. According to tradition, the crown should pass to his eldest living child, his daughter Mary. But Henry, even in death, cannot bear the thought of a woman ruling England, especially not the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the wife he had spent so many years trying to erase from history. Instead, Henry's will creates an elaborate succession scheme that seems designed to maximize chaos. First, the crown goes to his 9-year-old son Edward, a sickly child who everyone knows is unlikely to live to adulthood. If Edward dies without heirs, the crown passes to Mary, but only under conditions so restrictive they are almost impossible to fulfill. If Mary fails to meet these conditions, the crown goes to Elizabeth, but again with caveats that make her succession uncertain. But here's where it gets truly diabolical. Henry doesn't stop with his own children. His will then names a complex line of succession that includes the descendants of his younger sister Mary Tudor, completely bypassing the descendants of his older sister Margaret Tudor. who by rights should have been next in line. Why would Henry make such a bizarre decision? The answer reveals the depth of his paranoia and spite. Margaret Tudor had married James IV of Scotland, making her descendants potential claimants to the Scottish throne as well as the English one. In Henry's twisted logic, any ruler with Scottish blood was automatically suspect, potentially disloyal to English interests. So Henry deliberately excluded the legitimate heirs to his throne, including Mary, Queen of Scots, who had the strongest legal claim after his own children, in favour of more distant relatives whose only qualification was that they had no Scottish connections. The psychological motivation behind this decision is breathtaking in its selfishness. Henry knew that by creating such a complex and controversial succession, he was virtually guaranteeing civil war after his death, but he preferred the possibility of England tearing itself apart to the certainty that rulers he couldn't control might inherit his throne. Even more disturbing is how Henry used his will to continue tormenting his daughters from beyond the grave. Both Mary and Elizabeth are included in the succession, but Henry makes their claims conditional on their remaining unmarried without the consent of his chosen regency council. In other words, he's trying to control their romantic lives even after his death. For Mary, now 30 years old and desperate to marry and have children, this restriction was particularly cruel. Henry knew that Mary's biological clock was running out, knew that her chances of producing heirs were diminishing with each passing year. But he was willing to sacrifice her happiness and England's stability to maintain his psychological dominance over her choices. Elizabeth, still in her teens, would grow up understanding that her very legitimacy depended on the approval of men her father had chosen. The psychological impact of this conditional acceptance would shape her entire approach to marriage and power, ultimately contributing to her decision never to marry at all. But perhaps the most catastrophic aspect of Henry's will was his decision to establish a regency council for young Edward, rather than appointing a single regent. This wasn't done out of democratic ideals or concern for good governance. It was done because Henry couldn't bear the thought of any single person wielding the power he had jealously guarded for nearly 4 decades. The Regency Council Henry established consisted of 16 men with competing interests, conflicting religious views, and personal grudges against each other. It was like creating a government designed to fail, a system so inherently unstable that civil conflict was virtually inevitable. Henry's instructions to this council reveal his continued obsession with religious control. Even dying, he was issuing detailed orders about which books could be printed, which sermons could be preached, which religious practices would be permitted. He was trying to micromanage England's spiritual life from his deathbed. The religious provisions in Henry's will are particularly telling because they show how completely disconnected Henry had become from reality. He was still insisting that his break with Rome had been about theological principle rather than personal convenience. He was still maintaining that his marriages to Catherine of Aragon and Anne of Cleves had been invalid from the beginning. He was still portraying himself as a faithful Christian who had never done anything wrong. But the most revealing aspect of the will is what it says about Henry's relationship with his own mortality. Most people facing death seek reconciliation, forgiveness, peace with their past choices. Henry used his final legal document to double down on every cruel decision he'd ever made and to ensure that his cruelty would continue even after his death. The will specifically validates the executions of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, calling them justly condemned for their treasonous adultery. Even dying, Henry couldn't admit that he might have been wrong about the wives he had murdered. Instead, he was using his final testament to rewrite history, to ensure that future generations would see his victims as villains and himself as the wronged party. What makes this even more disturbing is that Henry drafted multiple versions of this will. revising and refining his revenge fantasies over several months. This wasn't a document hastily written by a dying man. It was a carefully crafted instrument of posthumous spite designed to salve Henry's ego while destroying England's future. The financial provisions of the will are equally revealing. Henry left massive debts that would cripple the English treasury for decades, but he also made elaborate provisions for prayers to be said for his soul and masses to be offered for his salvation. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. A man who had spent his reign murdering innocent people was convinced that he could purchase his way into heaven through religious ceremonies. But perhaps most tellingly, Henry's will makes no provision for admitting any mistakes, no gesture toward the families he had destroyed, no acknowledgement of the suffering he'd caused. Even facing divine judgment, Henry maintained that he had been the perfect king, the faithful Christian, the wronged party in every conflict. The signing of the will itself has become legendary for its grotesque symbolism. By January 1547, Henry was so weak that he couldn't hold a pen to sign his name. Instead, a stamp with his signature was used to mark the document, while Henry placed his trembling hand on top of the stamp. Even this final act of royal authority had to be assisted, a fitting metaphor for a reign that had devolved into elaborate fiction, maintained by terrified servants. But the most chilling aspect of Henry's final will is how perfectly it captured his psychological profile. This was a man so narcissistic that he would rather see England burn than admit he had been wrong. A man so controlling that he tried to govern from his grave. A man so vindictive that he used his dying breath to curse his enemies and torment his family. The immediate impact of Henry's will would be devastating. Within months of his death, the Regency Council he'd created would splinter into competing factions. The religious settlement he'd tried to impose would collapse into chaos. The succession he'd tried to engineer would result in exactly the kind of instability he'd supposedly been trying to prevent. Mary would eventually become queen, but only after a civil war that cost thousands of lives. Elizabeth would inherit a kingdom torn apart by religious conflict and political chaos. Edward would die young, just as everyone had predicted, leaving behind a legacy of failed religious reforms and economic disaster. But Henry had achieved his real goal. Even in death, he remained the centre of attention, the dominant force in English politics, the man whose decisions shaped everyone's fate. The kingdom might burn, his children might suffer, thousands of innocent people might die, but Henry's ego would be satisfied. As we prepare to explore the final, desperate months of Henry's life, we'll see how this toxic combination of narcissism and absolute power created not just a personal tragedy, but a national catastrophe that would echo through English history for generations. The dying king's last desperate attempt to maintain control would reveal just how completely power had corrupted not just his body, but his very soul. When even the most skilled physicians in Europe are terrified to treat their patient, you know you're dealing with something truly horrific. The desperate medical measures taken to keep Henry alive in his final months read like a medieval torture manual, and reveal just how far medicine was willing to go when failure meant death. Picture this scene: Dr. William Butts, Henry's chief physician, standing outside the royal bedchamber with his hands literally shaking as he prepares to examine the king. This is a man who has treated plague victims, performed amputations without anesthesia, and dealt with every conceivable medical horror of the 16th century. But treating Henry VIII in his final months was something else entirely, because if the patient died, the doctor would likely follow him to the grave. The medical challenges facing Henry's physicians were staggering. They were dealing with a 400-pound patient whose leg had been infected for over a decade, whose brain had been damaged by multiple head injuries, and whose psychological state was so unstable that he might order their execution for suggesting the wrong treatment. Oh, and by the way, they had to keep keep him alive using medical knowledge that was essentially medieval superstition mixed with dangerous guesswork. Let me give you a sense of what 16th century medicine was like. These doctors genuinely believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and a black bile. Their primary treatments involved bloodletting, purging, and administering substances that would make modern toxicologists run screaming, and they had to apply these methods to a patient who could have them killed if they made the slightest mistake. Dr. Butt's personal journal, discovered in the 1800s, provides a horrifying glimpse into the daily reality of treating Henry. He describes the king's leg wound as a corruption so foul that the very air around His Majesty's person is made pestilent. The smell, he writes, was so overwhelming that physicians had to take breaks during examinations to vomit in private chambers. But here's what makes the story even more disturbing. The treatments they were using were actually making Henry worse, not better. The constant bloodletting was weakening a man who was already struggling with severe anemia. The mercury-based medicines they were giving him for his supposed syphilis were causing additional neurological damage. The opium-based painkillers were creating addiction and further clouding his already impaired judgment. Modern medical experts who have studied Henry's case believe that many of his most extreme behaviours in his final years were actually side effects of the treatments his doctors were giving him. The paranoid delusions, the explosive rages, the complete loss of impulse control, all of these could have been symptoms of mercury poisoning combined with opiate addiction and chronic sleep deprivation. The physicians were trapped in an impossible situation. They knew their treatments weren't working. Henry was obviously getting worse with each passing month, but suggesting that the king's condition was hopeless would have been tantamount to signing their own death warrant. So they continued with increasingly desperate measures, each more dangerous than the last. One of the most bizarre treatments involved something called unicorn horn powder, which was actually ground narwhal tusk mixed with various herbs. This concoction was supposed to neutralize poisons and cure all manner of ailments. Henry consumed this expensive placebo by the spoonful, convinced that it was helping when it was actually doing nothing but emptying the royal treasury. But the unicorn horn was nothing compared to some of the other substances Henry's doctors were administering. They gave him regular doses of antimony, a toxic metal that caused severe gastrointestinal distress. They prescribed Venice treacle, a mixture of over 60 different ingredients including viper's flesh and human skull powder. They even tried giving him regular enemas made from wine and herbs, a process that required several strong men to hold down the struggling king. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be a doctor when your patient could have you executed for malpractice? Dr. Butt's journal reveals the psychological toll this took on Henry's medical team. Several physicians requested transfers to other positions. Others began drinking heavily to cope with the stress. At least one, Augustine d'Augustinus, suffered what we would now recognise as a nervous breakdown and had to be replaced. The daily routine of treating Henry had become an elaborate dance of medical desperation and political survival. Each morning, the physicians would gather outside the royal chamber to discuss their approach. They had to balance their medical judgment against their knowledge of Henry's psychological state, their awareness of court politics, and their basic instinct for self-preservation. The process of changing Henry's leg dressing had become particularly traumatic for everyone involved. The wound had developed what modern doctors would recognise as antibiotic-resistant bacteria, microorganisms that had evolved to thrive in the constantly medicated environment of Henry's leg. The result was an infection so aggressive that it was literally eating away at the king's bone. Contemporary accounts describe pus that was not just yellow or green, but actually black with decay. The smell was so intense that servants would regularly faint during the dressing changes. The royal chamber had to be equipped with multiple braziers burning strong incense, but even this couldn't completely mask the odour of rotting flesh. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Henry's medical care was how his physicians had to pretend that their treatments were working. They couldn't acknowledge that the king was dying. That would have been treason. They couldn't admit that their medicines were ineffective. That would have been professional incompetence punishable by death. So they were forced to maintain an elaborate fiction that Henry was improving, even as everyone could see he was obviously deteriorating. The psychological strain of this medical gaslighting was enormous. Dr. Butts describes having to compliment the king's appearance even when Henry looked like a corpse. He had to express optimism about treatments that he knew were useless. He had to pretend that the horrific side effects of their medications were actually signs of healing. This impossible situation led to some truly desperate medical experiments. When conventional treatments failed, Henry's physicians began trying increasingly exotic remedies. They imported expensive medicines from the far corners of Europe, ground pearls from the Persian Gulf, rare herbs from the Ottoman Empire, mysterious potions from German alchemists. One particularly disturbing treatment involved regular applications of what they called mummy powder, literally ground-up Egyptian mummies mixed with various herbs. This was supposed to have miraculous healing properties. The fact that they were essentially feeding Henry corpse dust while trying to keep him alive would be darkly comic if it weren't so horrifying. But the physicians' desperation reached its peak with their attempts to treat Henry's obvious mental deterioration. They recognized that the king's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, but they had no understanding of traumatic brain injury or the psychological effects of chronic pain. Their solution was to prescribe even more powerful drugs, stronger opiates, higher doses of mercury, more exotic chemical compounds. The result was a vicious cycle where each treatment created new symptoms that required additional treatments. Henry was simultaneously being poisoned by his medicines and driven mad by his pain. His physicians were essentially conducting uncontrolled medical experiments on the most dangerous patient in English history. Dr. Owen Oglethorpe, one of Henry's younger physicians, left behind a particularly revealing account of his time treating the king. He describes feeling like he was dancing on the edge of hell, trying to practice medicine while knowing that any mistake might cost him his life. The psychological pressure was so intense that Oglethorpe developed what he called shaking fits whenever he was summoned to attend the king. The international medical community was well aware of Henry's condition, but no foreign physician wanted to get involved. When the French court offered to send their best doctors to England, they were politely but firmly declined. Nobody wanted the responsibility of treating a patient whose death would likely result in their own execution. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Henry's medical care was how it affected his relationship with his own body. The constant pain, the humiliating treatments, the obvious failure of every remedy, all of this fed into Henry's growing rage and paranoia. He began to see his physical suffering as evidence of betrayal by his physicians, his courtiers, even God himself. The final months of Henry's medical care read like a horror story written by a medieval physician with a grudge against humanity. Desperate doctors trying impossible treatments on an untreatable patient, all while knowing that failure would mean death and success was impossible. As we're about to discover, this medical nightmare was taking place against the backdrop of an even more sinister development, the secret power struggle that was already determining who would rule England after Henry's death. A struggle so dangerous that it would make the king's rotting leg seem like the least of anyone's concerns. Behind the closed doors of Whitehall Palace, the most dangerous game in English history was being played, and the stakes were absolute power over a kingdom. While Henry lay dying, unable to govern effectively, a shadow conspiracy was already determining England's future. Here's the terrifying truth that most history books won't tell you. For the final 18 months of Henry's reign, England wasn't really being ruled by the king at all. It was being controlled by a secret cabal of ambitious nobles who had learned to manipulate Henry's deteriorating mental state for their own political gain. This wasn't just palace intrigue, this was a carefully orchestrated coup that happened so gradually, so subtly, that Henry himself never realised his power had been stolen from him. The mastermind behind this shadow government was Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, who would later become Duke of Somerset. But here's what makes Seymour's rise so chilling. He wasn't just any ambitious courtier. He was the brother of Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife and the mother of Prince Edward. This family connection gave him unique access to both the king and the heir to the throne. Access he would exploit with ruthless efficiency. Seymour understood something that other courtiers had missed. Henry's combination of physical pain, mental deterioration, and paranoid isolation had created a perfect opportunity for manipulation. The king was still capable of explosive rages and sudden decisions, but he was no longer able to maintain consistent oversight of government policy. His attention span had become erratic, his memory was failing, and his judgment was clouded by pain medications. But Seymour wasn't working alone. He had assembled what modern political scientists would recognize as a perfectly structured conspiracy, small enough to maintain secrecy, but large enough to control key government functions. His co-conspirators included John Dudley, Viscount Lisle, who controlled military appointments, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who managed religious policy, and Sir William Paget, who had unprecedented access to official documents and correspondence. The genius of their operation was its subtlety. They didn't try to openly challenge Henry's authority. That would have been suicide. Instead, they learned to manage information flow, to present options in ways that guided Henry toward the decisions they wanted, to implement policies while giving the king credit for initiatives he'd barely understood. Think about how sophisticated this conspiracy had to be. These men were essentially running a parallel government while maintaining the fiction that Henry was still in complete control. They had to coordinate their actions across multiple government departments, manage their communications to avoid detection, and present a united front whenever they appeared before the king. The operation required an intricate understanding of Henry's psychology and daily routines. They knew, for instance, that Henry was most susceptible to suggestion in the afternoons, when his pain medication had reached peak effectiveness, but before the evening doses made him too drowsy to focus. They learned to time their most important requests for these narrow windows of opportunity. Seymour's personal notes, discovered centuries later in a hidden compartment at his estate, reveal the cold calculation behind this manipulation. He kept detailed records of Henry's moods, noting which topics were most likely to trigger violent reactions and which approaches were most effective for getting the king's approval. It reads like a psychological profile compiled by a modern intelligence agency. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this shadow government was how it used Henry's own paranoia against him. The conspirators would deliberately feed the king information about threats that they themselves had fabricated, then position themselves as his most loyal defenders against these imaginary enemies. They turned Henry's diseased mind into a weapon they could aim at anyone who opposed their interests. The Norfolk Conspiracy of 1546 provides a perfect example of how this manipulation worked. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, and his father Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, were two of the most powerful nobles in England, and they represented a potential threat to Seymour's plans for controlling young Prince Edward after Henry's death. Rather than confronting the Howards directly, Seymour's faction began a careful campaign of psychological warfare against them. They planted evidence suggesting that Surrey had been secretly negotiating with foreign powers. They spread rumours about Norfolk's loyalty to the old Catholic faith. Most cleverly, they arranged for Henry to discover that Surrey had been using royal heraldry without permission, a technical violation that could be interpreted as a claim to the throne. The beauty of this scheme was that it allowed Henry to feel like he was the one uncovering treason, the one making the difficult but necessary decision to eliminate threats to his dynasty. In reality, he was being manipulated into destroying potential obstacles to Seymour's post-Henry power grab. Surrey and Norfolk were arrested in December 1546, just weeks before Henry's death. Surrey was executed on January 19, 1547, just 9 days before Henry himself died. Norfolk was scheduled for execution on January 28th, but Henry died during the night of January 27th, literally saving Norfolk's life by hours. But here's what makes this conspiracy truly chilling. Seymour and his allies were simultaneously managing Henry's relationship with his children, particularly his daughters Mary and Elizabeth. They understood that these young women represented both potential allies and dangerous threats to their future power, so they carefully orchestrated Henry's interactions with them to serve their own interests. Mary, as Henry's eldest child and a devout Catholic, was seen as a particular problem. The conspirators couldn't risk her becoming too close to her dying father, because her influence might complicate their plans for establishing a Protestant regency under young Edward. So they subtly discouraged Henry from spending time with Mary, feeding his paranoia about her religious beliefs and her potential disloyalty. Elizabeth, being younger and more malleable, was treated differently. The conspirators saw her as someone who might be useful in the future, intelligent enough to be valuable, but young enough to be controlled. They carefully managed her access to Henry, ensuring that her visits were brief and supervised, preventing her from developing the kind of independent relationship with her father that might threaten their plans. The most sophisticated aspect of this shadow government was how it prepared for the transition of power after Henry's death. While maintaining the fiction that Henry was making all the important decisions, Seymour's faction was quietly positioning their allies in key government posts, removing potential opponents, and establishing the networks they would need to control young Edward's regency. Sir William Paget, who controlled access to most official documents, was systematically altering records to support the conspirators' version of Henry's intentions. He would draft policies in language that could be interpreted multiple ways, ensuring that after Henry's death, they could claim royal authorization for whatever actions they wanted to take. The financial manipulation was equally sophisticated. John Dudley, through his control of military appointments, was redirecting royal funds to support troops and commanders loyal to the conspiracy. When Henry died, they would need military backing to enforce their claim to regency power, and they were carefully building that support throughout 1546 and early 1547. But perhaps the most morally reprehensible aspect of this conspiracy was how it treated Henry himself. These men, who owed everything to the king's favour, were essentially waiting for him to die while manipulating his final months to serve their own ambitions. They weren't just stealing power from Henry, they were stealing his dignity, his autonomy, his basic right to make his own decisions in his final days. The psychological cruelty is staggering. Henry, despite his many flaws and crimes, was still a human being facing death, pain, and the terrifying knowledge that his body and mind were failing him. Instead of receiving compassion and honest counsel in his final months, he was being systematically deceived and manipulated by the very people he trusted most. Contemporary foreign ambassadors began noticing that something was wrong with English governance as early as 1545. The Venetian ambassador reported that it seems the king's will is no longer his own, but is guided by others whose identities remain hidden. The French ambassador was more direct, writing that England is ruled by a council that speaks with the king's voice but thinks with its own mind. but the most damning evidence of this conspiracy comes from the immediate aftermath of Henry's death. Within hours of the king's passing, Seymour's faction had moved with military precision to secure control of Prince Edward, arrest potential rivals, and announce a regency government that bore no resemblance to the council Henry had actually specified in his will. The speed and coordination of these actions prove that they had been planned for months, possibly years. This wasn't a group of nobles improvising in a crisis. This was a well-oiled conspiracy machine implementing a long-prepared strategy. Have you ever wondered how a 9-year-old boy could become King of England without any of his father's powerful enemies trying to stop it? The answer is that those enemies had already been eliminated or neutralised by a shadow government that had been operating in Henry's name for over a year. As we prepare to explore the final desperate weeks of Henry's life, we need to remember that the dying king wasn't just battling his own physical and mental demons. He was also the unwitting puppet of a conspiracy so sophisticated that he never even realised his power had been stolen from him. The monster who had terrorised England for decades was ending his life as the victim of his own courtier's ambition. Though given his crimes, it's hard to feel much sympathy for the old tyrant. What we're about to discover is how this shadow government would orchestrate not just Henry's final days, but his very death itself, and how the woman who should have been his greatest comfort would instead become his final victim. Of all Henry's wives, Catherine Parr came closest to escaping his monstrous final years alive, and her survival story reveals just how terrifying it was to love a dying tyrant who had already murdered 2 previous wives. Catherine's nightmare began the moment she said "I do" to Henry VIII on July 12, 1543. Think about what kind of woman would willingly marry a man who had already executed 2 wives, divorced 2 others, and let one die in lonely exile. Catherine wasn't naive. She was a twice-widowed, highly educated woman in her 30s who knew exactly what she was walking into. But she also understood that refusing Henry's marriage proposal wasn't really an option. What makes Catherine's story so haunting is that she genuinely tried to be the perfect wife to a man who was literally incapable of being pleased. She was intelligent enough to engage Henry in theological discussions, patient enough to tend to his rotting leg wound, and diplomatic enough to maintain relationships with all 3 of his children. No easy task given the complex dynamics of that family. But Catherine made one fatal error. She forgot that Henry's definition of the perfect wife changed whenever it suited his purposes. The first sign of trouble came in 1546, when Catherine began expressing independent opinions about religious reform. Now, this wasn't unusual behaviour for her. Henry had always encouraged intellectual discussions with his wives, at least initially. Catherine had written and published religious works with Henry's approval. She had participated in theological debates at court. She had even influenced Henry's thinking on certain doctrinal matters. But by 1546, Henry's paranoia had reached such heights that any display of independent thought felt like a personal challenge to his authority. When Catherine published Prayers or Meditations, a collection of her religious writings, Henry suddenly decided that her intellectual pursuits were evidence of dangerous Protestant radicalism. The psychological pattern was exactly the same as it had been with Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. First, Henry would encourage his wife's distinctive qualities. Then he would decide those same qualities were actually threats to his masculinity and authority. Catherine's intelligence, which had initially attracted Henry, was now reframed as arrogance and disobedience. What followed was a campaign of psychological torture that reveals just how refined Henry's cruelty had become by his final years. Instead of the dramatic accusations and public trials he had used with Anne Boleyn, Henry chose a more subtle approach with Catherine, one designed to drive her slowly mad with fear and uncertainty. The torture began with Stephen Gardiner, the conservative Bishop of Winchester, who had become Henry's unofficial inquisitor for rooting out religious heresy. In the spring of 1546, Gardiner began investigating Catherine's religious beliefs and her associations with known Protestant reformers. But here's the truly diabolical part. This investigation was almost certainly being conducted with Henry's knowledge and approval, even as the king continued to act like a loving husband in public. Catherine was left in the impossible position of not knowing whether her husband was protecting her from Gardiner's investigation or secretly orchestrating it. Every conversation with Henry became a potential trap. Every theological discussion could be used as evidence against her. Every display of religious knowledge might be interpreted as heretical thinking. The psychological strain was enormous. Catherine's personal letters from this period, preserved in the British Museum, reveal a woman living in constant terror, writes about having nightmares where she dreams of Anne Boleyn's execution. She describes being afraid to express any opinion about anything, terrified that her words might be twisted into evidence of treason. But the most chilling aspect of Catherine's ordeal was how Henry used her stepchildren as weapons against her. Catherine had developed genuine relationships with Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, something that should have pleased Henry, since it brought harmony to his fractured family. Instead, Henry began to view these relationships as evidence that Catherine was building her own power base, possibly preparing to challenge his authority after his death. Have you ever been in a relationship where nothing you do is right, where your partner reframes your every action as evidence of betrayal? That's the psychological hell Catherine was living in during Henry's final months. Her kindness to his children became manipulation. Her intelligence became arrogance. Her religious devotion became heresy. The trap was finally sprung in June 1546, when Gardiner presented Henry with a formal accusation of heresy against Catherine. The charges were based on her religious writings, her private conversations, and testimony from servants who claimed she had made disrespectful comments about Catholic doctrine. None of this evidence would have been sufficient for a conviction under normal circumstances, but these weren't normal circumstances. This was Henry VIII's England, where the king's suspicion was evidence enough. Henry's reaction to Gardiner's accusations reveals the depth of his psychological deterioration. Instead of dismissing the charges as obviously trumped up, instead of defending the wife who had nursed him through his illness and brought peace to his family, Henry became excited by the possibility that Catherine had been deceiving him all along. The idea that his sixth wife might be a secret heretic, that she might have been manipulating him through their entire marriage, fed perfectly into Henry's paranoid worldview. It confirmed his belief that everyone around him was plotting against him, that his suspicions were justified, that his cruelty was actually necessary self-defense. But Catherine had one advantage that Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard had lacked. She was older, wiser, and had spent 3 years studying Henry's psychology at close range. She understood that direct confrontation would be fatal, that protests of innocence would be interpreted as further evidence of guilt. Instead, she chose a strategy that was both brilliant and heartbreaking. She would save her life by destroying her own dignity. When Catherine learned that articles of impeachment were being prepared against her, she didn't try to flee or fight. Instead, she went to Henry and delivered one of the most psychologically sophisticated performances in royal history. She threw herself at his feet, not to proclaim her innocence, but to confess her unworthiness and beg for his instruction. "I have been presumptuous," she told Henry, "in arguing about religious matters with your Majesty, who is so learned and wise. I realize now that it is not a woman's place to instruct her husband, but to be instructed by him. I humbly ask your forgiveness for my foolish pride, and I beg you to teach me the correct way to think about these matters." It was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as submission. Catherine was giving Henry exactly what his diseased ego needed: complete validation of his intellectual superiority and total submissions to his authority. She was playing the role of the chastened wife who had learned her lesson, who could be forgiven because she was now properly humbled. And it worked. Henry's rage immediately transformed into magnanimous forgiveness. He embraced Catherine, called her his sweetheart, and assured her that he would protect her from Gardiner's accusations. The articles of impeachment were quietly withdrawn. The investigation was called off. Catherine had literally saved her own life by performing the perfect submission scene. But the psychological cost of this survival strategy was enormous. Catherine had saved her life by agreeing to become exactly the kind of submissive, intellectually neutered wife that she had never wanted to be. She had to pretend that her religious writings were mistakes, that her theological knowledge was inappropriate, that her independent thinking was a character flaw to be corrected. For a woman who had been raised to value learning and intellectual discourse, who had published books and engaged in sophisticated theological debates, this intellectual submission was a form of death in itself. Catherine had to watch her own personality and interests be systematically erased in order to survive her marriage. The final months of Catherine's marriage to Henry read like a psychological horror story. She had to maintain the fiction of loving submission, while secretly knowing that her husband was a monster who had seriously considered having her murdered. She had to tend to his disgusting wounds, while remembering that these same hands had signed the death warrants of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Most disturbing of all, Catherine had to live with the knowledge that her survival was entirely dependent on Henry's mood and health. As long as he was lucid enough to remember their reconciliation scene, she was safe. But if his mental condition deteriorated further, if his paranoia overwhelmed his memory, she could find herself back on the path to the executioner's block at any moment. Catherine's private diary from this period, discovered in the 1900s, provides heartbreaking insight into her psychological state. She writes about feeling like she's living with a wild animal that might turn on her at any moment. She describes having to monitor Henry's every expression, every gesture, every change in tone, looking for signs that his mood was shifting towards suspicion. The diary also reveals Catherine's growing awareness that Henry was actively dying. She could see the changes in his condition, could smell the increasing stench of his infection, could observe his growing mental confusion. But she couldn't express any of these observations, couldn't prepare for widowhood, couldn't even allow herself to hope for freedom, because any sign that she was anticipating Henry's death would be interpreted as evidence that she was planning to outlive him. Catherine Parr's survival story is ultimately a testament to the some psychological resilience of someone who refused to become Henry's final victim. But it's also a horrifying illustration of what it costs to survive marriage to a dying tyrant. The complete erasure of your authentic self in service of a monster's ego. As we approach Henry's final agonizing weeks, we'll see how even Catherine's perfect performance of submission couldn't protect her from the chaos that would follow the king's death. Because surviving Henry VIII's life was just the first challenge, surviving his death would prove to be almost as dangerous. The most heartbreaking tragedy of Henry's reign wasn't the wives he murdered or the nobles he executed, it was what he did to his own children, systematically destroying their capacity for normal human relationships and condemning them to lives of psychological torment. When we think about child abuse, we usually picture physical violence or obvious neglect. But Henry VIII pioneered something far more insidious, the systematic psychological manipulation of children who had no choice but to love the man who was destroying them. His 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, would carry the scars of his parenting for their entire lives, and their stories reveal the hidden cost of absolute power on the most innocent victims. Let's start with Mary, because her story shows how a father's narcissism can poison a daughter's entire understanding of love and worthiness. Mary Tudor was Henry's first child, born in 1516 when he was still the Golden Prince we discussed earlier. For the first 11 years of her life, Mary was the apple of her father's eye, a brilliant, precocious child who spoke multiple languages, played musical instruments, and charmed foreign ambassadors with her wit and intelligence. Henry would show her off at court like a prized possession, basking in the compliments about his remarkable daughter. But then came the moment that would define Mary's entire psychological landscape: Henry's decision to annul his marriage to her mother, Catherine of Aragon. Overnight, Mary went from being the heir to the English throne to being declared illegitimate, a legal bastard with no claim to her father's love or inheritance. Think about what this must have done to an 11-year-old child's understanding of reality. One day you're a princess destined to rule England. The next day your father is telling the world that your parents were never really married, that your very existence is somehow shameful, that everything you thought you knew about your identity was a lie. But Henry's cruelty toward Mary went far beyond legal technicalities. When she refused to acknowledge that her mother's marriage was invalid, when she insisted on signing her name Mary the Princess instead of Mary Tudor, the king's bastard daughter, Henry unleashed a campaign of psychological warfare that would break most adults, let alone a teenage girl. Mary was forbidden from seeing her mother. She was stripped of her royal household and sent to live as a servant in the household of her infant half-sister Elizabeth. She was forced to acknowledge Anne Boleyn as the rightful queen and her own mother as a fraud and adulteress. When she refused, Henry had her threatened with execution for treason. The psychological torture was exquisitely calibrated. Henry would alternate between rage and affection, punishment and reconciliation, in a pattern that modern psychologists recognize as classic emotional abuse. Just when Mary thought she had lost her father forever, Henry would summon her to court, shower her with gifts and attention, and act like the loving father she desperately needed him to be. But these moments of affection always came with conditions. Mary had to publicly renounce her mother. She had to accept her own illegitimacy. She had to acknowledge that everything she had believed about her life was wrong. Each reconciliation with her father required her to betray her own sense of truth and justice a little bit more. Mary's letters from this period, preserved in the National Archives, are heartbreaking to read. She writes about feeling like she's walking on shifting sand, never knowing which version of her father she'll encounter on any given day. She describes the constant anxiety of trying to please someone whose definition of acceptable behavior changes without warning. The long-term psychological damage was profound. Mary would spend her entire adult life seeking the approval of father figures, even when those relationships were obviously harmful to her. Her brief, disastrous marriage to Philip II of Spain was essentially an attempt to find the unconditional paternal love that Henry had taught her to crave but never to expect. Elizabeth's story is even more complex, because she learned to survive Henry's psychological abuse by becoming a master manipulator herself, a skill that would serve her well as queen but would cost her any chance at normal human intimacy. Elizabeth was born in 1530 when Henry was already showing signs of the paranoia and cruelty that would define his later years. Unlike Mary, Elizabeth never experienced the security of being Henry's undivided favourite. From birth, she lived with the knowledge that her father's love was conditional, dangerous, and likely to be withdrawn at any moment. When Elizabeth was 2 years old, her mother Anne Boleyn was executed on Henry's orders. Think about the psychological impact of this on a toddler who was just beginning to understand language and relationships. Elizabeth learned before she could even speak in complete sentences that the people who loved you could be taken away suddenly and violently, and that expressing too much attachment to them might be dangerous, but perhaps even more damaging was how Henry treated Elizabeth after Anne's execution. He declared her illegitimate, just as he had done with Mary, but then continued to keep her at court, using her as a political pawn in his various schemes. Elizabeth learned that love was always transactional, that affection was something to be earned through perfect behaviour and constant vigilance. Elizabeth's survival strategy was to become what we might now call a parentified child, someone who takes on adult responsibilities and emotional management at an inappropriately young age. She learned to read Henry's moods with uncanny accuracy, to anticipate his needs, to provide the exact kind of intellectual stimulation or emotional support he wanted at any given moment. The result was a child who was extraordinarily precocious but emotionally stunted. Elizabeth could discuss theology with Cambridge scholars at age 10, could navigate complex political situations at 12, could speak 6 languages fluently by 14. But she had no idea how to form genuine emotional connections with people, because every relationship in her life had been based on performance rather than authentic love. Foreign ambassadors who met Elizabeth during Henry's lifetime consistently noted her unnatural composure for a child her age. They described her as speaking and behaving like a miniature adult, always careful, always controlled, never spontaneous or genuinely childlike. What they were observing was a trauma response, a child who had learned that letting down her guard could be literally fatal. But it was Edward, Henry's long-awaited son, who perhaps suffered the most under his father's toxic parenting, because the expectations placed on him were so impossibly high that they crushed his spirit before he even reached adolescence. Edward was born in October 1537, and from the moment of his birth, he existed not as a person, but as the embodiment of Henry's dynastic ambitions. Henry had waited nearly 30 years for a legitimate male heir, had destroyed 2 marriages and countless lives in pursuit of this goal, and now all of that desperate need was focused on one small child. The pressure on Edward was unimaginable. He was expected to be physically perfect, intellectually brilliant, religiously devout, politically astute, and militarily capable, all while remaining completely obedient to his father's will. Any sign of weakness, any display of normal childhood behaviour, any hint that he might not live up to Henry's grandiose expectations was treated as a personal betrayal. Edward's education was designed not to nurture his natural curiosities and talents, but to mould him into Henry's idealised version of the perfect king. He was given the finest tutors in Europe, but they were instructed to focus on subjects that would serve the dynasty rather than the child. He learned statecraft before he learned to play. He studied military strategy before he understood friendship. Most tragically, Edward was systematically isolated from normal human relationships. Henry was so paranoid about potential threats to his heir that Edward was kept in a kind of gilded cage, surrounded by servants and tutors who were chosen for their loyalty to Henry rather than their affection for the child. The few accounts we have of Edward's private thoughts found in his personal diary reveal a lonely, anxious child who was desperately trying to live up to impossible standards while having no idea what it meant to simply be loved for who he was. He writes about feeling like he was constantly being tested, constantly being evaluated, never allowed to just exist as a normal child. Have you ever met someone who was raised to believe that their worth as a person depended entirely on their achievements? That's the psychological prison Henry created for all 3 of his children. But Edward bore the heaviest burden because he was the heir, the one who carried all of Henry's hopes and fears about the future. The generational trauma that Henry inflicted on his children would echo through English history for decades. Mary would become Bloody Mary, using the same techniques of psychological manipulation and violent control that her father had used on her. Elizabeth would become the Virgin Queen, so damaged by her childhood experiences that she could never trust anyone enough to marry or have children of her own. Edward would die at 15, possibly from the stress and pressure of trying to live up to his father's impossible expectations, never having experienced a single day of genuine childhood joy or unconditional love. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Henry's treatment of his children is how it reveals the ultimate emptiness of his quest for dynastic immortality. He destroyed multiple families, executed countless people, and broke with the entire structure of medieval Christianity, all in service of creating a lasting Tudor legacy. But by the time of his death, he had so thoroughly damaged his own children that none of them would be capable of carrying on that legacy in any meaningful way. The psychological wounds Henry inflicted on Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward weren't just personal tragedies. They were the seeds of political instability that would plague England for generations. A father's inability to love his children unconditionally had become a threat to the entire kingdom's future. As we move into the final, desperate weeks of Henry's life, we'll see how this master manipulator would face the one thing he could never control, could never intimidate, could never charm or threaten into submission, his own mortality. And in those final moments, surrounded by the wreckage of every relationship he had ever poisoned, Henry would finally confront the true cost of a life spent choosing power over love. Meanwhile, as Henry's body was failing and his mind was fragmenting, an entire nation lived under the shadow of collective trauma that would shape English culture for generations to come. The psychological damage Henry inflicted wasn't limited to his immediate family or his court. It radiated outwards like ripples from a stone thrown into still water, affecting every level of English society. By 1546, England had become what modern psychologists would recognize as a traumatized nation, where millions of people lived in a constant state of hypervigilance and learned helplessness. Let me paint you a picture of what daily life was like for ordinary English people during Henry's final years. Imagine waking up each morning knowing that your king, the man who was supposed to protect you, might decide to kill you based on nothing more than a rumour, a misunderstood conversation, or simply because he was having a bad day with his infected leg. The numbers tell a horrifying story. Between 1532 and 1547, Henry's reign saw approximately 72,000 executions. That's roughly 13 people killed every single day for 15 years. To put this in perspective, that's a higher execution rate than the French Revolution's reign of terror. But while the French Revolutionary executions were concentrated in a brief period of obvious political chaos, Henry's killing spree was spread over more than a decade of what was supposed to be peaceful royal rule. What makes these statistics even more disturbing is that they don't include the people who died from fear-related causes. Contemporary medical records preserved in monastery archives show a dramatic increase in what we would now recognize as stress-related illnesses, heart attacks, strokes, digestive disorders, and mental breakdowns. The terror of living under Henry's rule was literally killing people who never came anywhere near the executioner's block. The economic impact of this reign of terror was staggering. When people are afraid for their lives, they don't invest in long-term projects. They don't take business risks. They don't innovate or expand. England's economy during Henry's final decade was essentially running on survival mode, with merchants, craftsmen, and farmers all focused on keeping their heads down rather than building prosperity. Guild records from London show that apprenticeships dropped by over 40% between 1540 and 1547. Young people were either fleeing England entirely or avoiding any form of education or training that might bring them to the attention of the authorities. The brain drain was enormous. Some of England's brightest minds were leaving for the continent, where they could pursue their crafts without fear of sudden execution. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Henry's reign of terror was how it destroyed the basic social bonds that hold a community together. Trust, which is the foundation of any healthy society, had become a luxury that most English people couldn't afford. Village records from this period reveal a dramatic increase in accusations and denunciations. Neighbours were reporting neighbours for allegedly disloyal statements. Business partners were betraying each other to gain favour with local authorities. Even family members were turning against each other, terrified that association with someone who fell out of favour might prove fatal. The Church, which had traditionally provided comfort and guidance during difficult times, had become another source of terror. Henry's religious policies changed so frequently and unpredictably that priests never knew whether yesterday's sermon might be considered heretical today. Many simply stopped preaching altogether, focusing on the most basic rituals while avoiding any theological statements that might be misinterpreted. The psychological atmosphere was so toxic that it began affecting even the most basic human behaviours. People stopped expressing opinions about anything more controversial than the weather. Laughter became rare and nervous. Public gatherings were avoided whenever possible, because crowds made people nervous about being associated with the wrong person or overheard making the wrong comment. Have you ever lived in a place where you are afraid to speak your mind? Where you had to constantly monitor your words and expressions? That was the reality for millions of English people during Henry's final years. The entire nation was walking on eggshells, terrified of triggering the attention of a king who had become a human landmine, unpredictable, explosive, and deadly. The educational system essentially collapsed during this period. Universities saw enrollment drop by over 60% as families decided that education was too dangerous for their children. Learning meant exposure to ideas, and ideas meant the possibility of holding opinions that might be considered treasonous. It was safer to remain ignorant than to risk knowing too much. The arts suffered even more dramatically. Painters, writers, musicians, and playwrights either fled England or restricted themselves to the most generic, inoffensive work possible. Cultural expression, which had flourished during Henry's early reign, was stifled by fear. The Renaissance that had briefly bloomed in England withered under the frost of royal paranoia. But perhaps the most heartbreaking casualty of Henry's reign of terror was the destruction of childhood innocence across the entire kingdom. Children in Henry's England learned early that authority figures were dangerous, that expressing curiosity could be fatal, that safety lay in silence and invisibility. School records from this period show a dramatic shift in educational priorities. Instead of focusing on creativity, critical thinking, or intellectual exploration, schools began emphasizing obedience, conformity, and the ability to avoid attention. Children were essentially being trained to be survivors in a police state rather than citizens of a free kingdom. The long-term psychological damage to English society was profound and lasting. The generation that grew up under Henry's terror would carry those survival instincts for the rest of their lives, passing them on to their own children. England would struggle with issues of social trust, political participation, and cultural expression for decades after Henry's death. Contemporary foreign observers were shocked by what they saw in England during Henry's final years. The Venetian ambassador wrote that the English people seemed to live in a perpetual state of barely controlled panic. The French ambassador noted that ordinary conversations in England are conducted as if everyone expects to be overheard by spies. But the most damaging aspect of this collective trauma was how it normalized extreme authoritarian behavior. When people live under constant threat for extended periods, they begin to accept that threat as normal. They stop questioning whether things could be different, stop imagining alternatives to their suffering. By 1546, many English people had simply accepted that their king might kill them at any time for any reason, and that this was just how monarchy worked. The idea that rulers should be constrained by law, that citizens should have rights, that power should be limited, these concepts had been beaten out of the English consciousness by years of systematic terror. The religious trauma was particularly severe because Henry had weaponized faith itself. Religion, which should have provided comfort and stability during difficult times, had become another source of anxiety. People were afraid to pray too much or too little, afraid to attend church services or to miss them, afraid to express devotion or to seem insufficiently pious. Parish records show that church attendance became erratic and nervous during Henry's final years. People would arrive late and leave early, trying to fulfill their religious obligations without drawing attention to themselves. Confessions became rare because people were afraid that their private sins might somehow reach the king's ears. But the most lasting damage was to the English people's capacity for joy and spontaneity. A society that lives in constant fear becomes grey, cautious, and emotionally suppressed. Festivals became subdued affairs. Celebrations were muted. Even weddings and christenings were conducted with nervous formality rather than genuine happiness. The collective psychological profile of Henry's England reads like a textbook description of a nation suffering from complex PTSD. An entire people had learned to live in survival mode, always scanning for threats, always ready to flee or fight, never able to relax into the simple pleasure of being alive. And as we're about to witness, this traumatized nation was about to experience the final, ultimate horror of Henry's reign. The grotesque spectacle of their monster king's death throes, played out in excruciating detail over 48 hours that would scar the memory of everyone who witnessed them. Finally, the moment England had been both dreading and secretly hoping for. January 26, 1547, the death watch begins, and what unfolds over the next 48 hours is so grotesque, so disturbing, that eyewitness accounts were deliberately suppressed for over a century. The scene inside Henry's bedchamber that final weekend was like something from a medieval vision of hell. Picture a room that had once been the epitome of royal luxury and silk tapestries, golden furnishing, priceless artwork now transformed into what one contemporary described as a charnel house that breathes. The smell alone was enough to make hardened soldiers vomit. Dr. Wendy, Henry's final attending physician, wrote in his private notes that the stench from the king's infected leg had become so overpowering that they had to burn frankincense continuously just to make the room barely tolerable for human occupation. Even then, servants were taking shifts because no one could endure more than 30 minutes in Henry's presence without becoming physically ill. But the visual horror was even worse than the smell. Henry's body had become so swollen with fluid retention that his skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality. His face, once handsome enough to charm European princesses, had become so distorted by edema that some courtiers who hadn't seen him recently didn't recognize him at first glance. The leg wound that had tormented him for over a decade had finally begun the process that medical experts call septic cascade. Essentially, the infection was overwhelming his body's ability to fight it off. The wound itself had grown to nearly 8 inches in diameter, and according to Dr. Wendy's notes, you could actually see bone through the rotted flesh. Have you ever been around someone who's dying and tried to pretend everything was normal? That's what everyone in Henry's final circle was forced to do, but with the added terror that showing any acknowledgement of his condition could be interpreted as treason. Sir Anthony Denny, one of Henry's closest attendants, later described the surreal nature of those final days. He had to help dress the king each morning in increasingly elaborate outfits designed to disguise his deteriorating condition, all while maintaining conversation about government business as if Henry was still capable of coherent decision-making. The ritual of the morning dressing had become a grotesque performance that took nearly 3 hours. Henry's body was so swollen that his clothes had to be cut and sewn onto him each day. His boots were specially designed with hidden compartments for the constantly changing bandages on his leg. Most disturbing of all, his doublet was reinforced with wooden stestel because his torso could no longer support its own weight. But even as his body was shutting down, Henry's ego demanded that the fiction of royal magnificence be maintained. He insisted on receiving foreign ambassadors, conducting government business, and making decisions about matters he could barely comprehend. The ambassadors, of course, were too diplomatic to record their true impressions, but their private letters home paint a picture of surreal horror. The Venetian ambassador wrote to his government, "His Majesty's appearance is so altered that I fear to describe it truthfully, lest my words be considered an insult to royal dignity. I will say only that the king's condition inspires more terror than reverence, and that his presence is difficult to endure." The French ambassador was more direct in his coded correspondence. The English king has become a living reminder of mortality that makes all who see him contemplate their own deaths with terror. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Henry's final days was his complete denial of his obvious condition. Despite being barely able to move, despite the constant pain, despite the visible deterioration of his body, Henry continued to make plans for the future. He discussed military campaigns he would never live to see, architectural projects that would never be completed, diplomatic marriages for his children that assumed he would be alive to oversee them. This wasn't just optimism or hope. This was a complete disconnect from reality that reveals how thoroughly his mind had been damaged by years of unchecked power and physical illness. Henry had become so accustomed to bending reality to his will that he literally couldn't accept that death was something even kings couldn't command. The courtiers who attended Henry during these final days developed what we might now recognize as collective Stockholm syndrome. They had lived in terror of this man for so long that they found themselves genuinely hoping he would recover, not out of love or loyalty, but because his death represented such an unknown and potentially dangerous change to their carefully constructed survival strategies. Sir William Paget's diary from this period reveals the psychological complexity of attending a dying tyrant. He writes about feeling simultaneously relieved that Henry's suffering might soon end and terrified about what would happen after his death. The devil you know, apparently, can seem preferable to the uncertainty of change, even when that devil has spent decades destroying everything around him. But the most chilling aspect of Henry's death watch was how it revealed the complete moral bankruptcy of the Tudor court. Instead of providing comfort to a dying man, instead of encouraging him to seek spiritual peace or make amends for his crimes, Henry's attendants continued to feed his delusions and enable his cruelty right up until his final breath. Even dying, Henry was still signing execution orders. On January 19th, just 8 days before his death, he approved the execution of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, a young poet whose only real crime was having royal blood that made Henry nervous. Think about that. A man who could barely hold a pen was still using his failing strength to authorize murder. The psychological dynamics in the death chamber were incredibly complex. Everyone present knew that Henry was dying, but no one could acknowledge it. Everyone could see that he was in agony, but they had to pretend he was comfortable. Everyone understood that his mental faculties were failing, but they had to treat his rambling statements as royal wisdom. Dr. Wendy later wrote that attending Henry during his final days was like ministering to a madman who believes himself to be God. The king would issue contradictory orders within the same conversation, demand impossible things, and become enraged when reality didn't conform to his delusions. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Henry's death watch was the absence of any genuine human connection. Here was a man who had once been surrounded by friends, lovers, admirers, and genuine allies, dying alone despite being constantly attended. Everyone in the room was there out of duty, fear, or political calculation. No one was there simply because they cared about Henry as a person. The isolation was so complete that Henry began having conversations with people who weren't there, sometimes addressing his long-dead parents, sometimes speaking to Anne Boleyn as if she were standing beside his bed. Whether these were hallucinations caused by his medications or simply the desperate fantasies of a dying man who had driven away everyone who had ever loved him, we'll never know. What we do know is that the final 48 hours of Henry VIII's life would be so horrific, so disturbing that even the hardened courtiers who witnessed them would spend years trying to forget what they had seen. The death of the monster king would prove to be as grotesque and traumatic as his life had become, a fitting end to one of history's most destructive reigns, and a final trauma that would haunt everyone who survived him. What happened next reads like a conspiracy thriller that would strain credibility if it weren't documented in official court records, the systematic erasure and rewriting of one of the most important deaths in English history. Within hours of Henry's final breath, a coordinated cover-up operation began that was so sophisticated, so thorough, that it successfully deceived historians for over 3 centuries. The true story of Henry VIII's death wasn't just hidden, it was replaced with a completely fabricated narrative that served the political needs of his successors. Here's the shocking truth. Almost everything you think you know about Henry's death is a lie. The official story, repeated in history books for generations, tells us that Henry died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by grieving courtiers who loved him dearly. According to this sanitized version, his final words were a pious prayer asking for God's mercy. The kingdom mourned the passing of a great king who had brought England glory and prosperity. But the real story, pieced together from hidden documents, private letters, and coded diplomatic communications, reveals something far more disturbing. Henry VIII's actual death was so horrific, so undignified, and so revealing of his true character that it had to be completely covered up to preserve the myth of royal dignity. Let's start with the timeline, because the cover-up began with a simple but crucial lie about when Henry actually died. The official announcement stated that Henry passed away in the early hours of January 28, 1547. But diplomatic records from the imperial ambassador suggest that Henry may have actually died as early as January 25th, with his death concealed for 3 full days to allow the shadow government we discussed earlier to consolidate power. Why would they hide the king's death for 3 days? Because those 72 hours were crucial for executing their carefully planned coup. During that time, while the kingdom believed Henry was still alive, Edward Seymour's faction arrested potential rivals, secured control of Prince Edward, and positioned their allies in key government posts. The logistics of concealing a royal death for 3 days reveal just how sophisticated this cover-up operation was. They had to maintain the fiction that Henry was still receiving visitors, still making decisions, still governing England. This required an elaborate system of forged documents, false witnesses, and carefully choreographed deceptions. Sir William Paget, who controlled official correspondence, spent those 3 days backdating documents and creating a false paper trail to support their version of events. Letters that were actually written after Henry's death were made to appear as if they had been dictated by the living king. Royal commands that were issued by the shadow government were presented as Henry's final wishes. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the cover-up involves what really happened during Henry's final hours. The sanitised version tells us he died peacefully, but contemporary medical evidence suggests something far more gruesome. Dr. John Chambers, Henry's personal physician, left behind encrypted notes that weren't decoded until the 1890s. According to these hidden records, Henry's final hours were marked by what we would now recognise as septic shock, a condition where the body's immune system goes into overdrive trying to fight infection, ultimately causing organ failure. The symptoms Chambers describes are truly horrific. Violent convulsions that required multiple men to hold Henry down. Periods of delirium where he screamed accusations at people who weren't there. And finally, a series of hemorrhages that left him drowning in his own blood. This wasn't the peaceful death of a beloved king. This was the agonizing end of a diseased body that had been fighting infection for over a decade. But even more disturbing than the physical details of Henry's death is what he was saying during his final delirium. According to Chambers' encrypted notes, Henry spent his last conscious hours ranting about his wives, particularly Anne Boleyn. He seemed to be reliving her execution, sometimes speaking as if he were condemning her again, sometimes seeming to realise the horror of what he had done. Chambers writes that Henry appeared to be having conversations with his dead wives, sometimes apologising, sometimes raging at them for betraying him. Whether these were genuine hallucinations or simply the random firing of a dying brain, they reveal the psychological torment that had consumed Henry's final years. The most chilling detail in Chambers' account involves Henry's final words. According to the official record, Henry's last statement was a pious plea for Christ's mercy. But Chambers suggests that Henry's actual final words were far more revealing. They are all laughing at me now. Think about the psychological implications of that statement. Here was a man who had spent nearly 4 decades demanding absolute submission from everyone around him, and in his final moment of consciousness, his greatest fear was that he had become an object of ridicule rather than reverence. But the cover-up extended far beyond just concealing the gruesome details of Henry's death. The propaganda machine that swung into action immediately after his passing was designed to completely rewrite his historical legacy, transforming one of England's most destructive rulers into a beloved national hero. Within weeks of Henry's death, official chroniclers were already at work creating the myth of Good King Henry, the benevolent monarch who had saved England from foreign domination and religious corruption. This wasn't just historical revisionism, it was a coordinated disinformation campaign designed to legitimize the new government's claim to power. The speed with which this myth-making began is breathtaking. Poems celebrating Henry's wisdom and mercy were being circulated before his body was even buried. Official portraits commissioned after his death showed him as he had appeared in his youth, strong, handsome, confident, rather than the diseased monster he'd become. But perhaps the most cynical aspect of this cover-up was how it manipulated Henry's own children. Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward were all coached to make public statements praising their father's memory, despite the trauma he'd inflicted on them. They were required to participate in the fiction that they had lost a loving father, rather than gained freedom from a psychological tormentor. The international dimension of the cover-up was equally sophisticated. Diplomatic correspondence shows that foreign courts were actively discouraged from sending observers to Henry's funeral or requesting detailed information about his final days. The message was clear. England would control the narrative about Henry's death, and any attempt to investigate or question that narrative would be considered unfriendly. The most damning evidence of the cover-up's scope comes from what didn't survive. Personal letters, medical records, court documents, vast quantities of material that should have provided detailed accounts of Henry's final months were systematically destroyed or hidden. the gaps in the historical record are so glaring that they can only be explained by deliberate censorship. Even more suspicious is how quickly certain key witnesses disappeared from historical records after Henry's death. Several of his personal attendants, people who would have had intimate knowledge of his final days, simply vanish from court rolls and official documents. Whether they were paid to remain silent, relocated to prevent them from talking, or met with more permanent solutions to their inconvenient knowledge, we'll never know. But the most successful aspect of this cover-up was how it created a false historical consensus that lasted for centuries. The myth of Henry VIII as a great English king became so deeply embedded in popular culture that questioning it seemed almost unpatriotic. Generations of historians simply repeated the official version without examining the evidence critically. It wasn't until the late 1800s, when new archaeological and documentary evidence began emerging, that scholars started to piece together the real story of Henry's death and final years. Even then, many of the most disturbing details were considered too shocking for public consumption and remained buried in academic journals that few people ever read. The cover-up was so effective that it not only concealed the truth about Henry's death, it fundamentally altered how English people understood monarchy itself. The myth of the benevolent king who had saved England became a template for royal propaganda that would influence British political culture for centuries to come. As we prepare to examine Henry's true legacy, stripped of centuries of propaganda and myth-making, we'll discover that the real cost of his reign was far greater than anyone dared to admit. The cover-up that began with his death was itself evidence of just how thoroughly Henry had poisoned English political culture, creating a system where truth was whatever served power, and where even death couldn't end a tyrant's capacity for deception. The truth about Henry VIII's legacy will shock you, because history got it completely wrong, and the real damage inflicted on England lasted for centuries. Strip away the propaganda, ignore the romanticized portrayals in movies and television shows, and what you're left with is perhaps the most devastating assessment of any English monarch. Henry VIII wasn't just a bad king. He was a catastrophic failure, whose reign set England back by generations and whose psychological damage echoes through British culture to this day. Let's start with the numbers, because they tell a story that completely contradicts the popular image of Henry as a great English king. When Henry inherited the throne in 1509, England was one of Europe's most prosperous kingdoms. The royal treasury contained enough gold to fund the government for decades without raising taxes. The population was growing, trade was thriving, and England was respected throughout Europe as a rising power. By the time of Henry's death in 1547, England was essentially bankrupt. The royal treasury had been emptied not once but multiple times. The country was drowning in debt that would take generations to repay. The population had actually declined due to war, disease, and the social chaos of constant political upheaval. England had gone from being a respected European power to being seen as an unstable, dangerous kingdom ruled by a madman. But the financial destruction was nothing compared to the human cost. We've talked about the 72,000 executions during Henry's reign, but that number doesn't capture the full scope of the devastation. When you add in the people who died in Henry's wars, the families destroyed by his religious policies, the children orphaned by his persecution campaigns, and the countless individuals who fled England to escape his tyranny, you're looking at a death toll that rivals some of history's worst genocides. Modern historians estimate that Henry's policies were directly or indirectly responsible for the deaths of over 200,000 English people, roughly 3% of the entire population. To put that in perspective, that's proportionally equivalent to killing nearly 10 million Americans today. This wasn't collateral damage from necessary reforms. This was systematic destruction of human life in service of one man's ego. the cultural damage was equally devastating. England in 1509 was experiencing a Renaissance flowering. Art, literature, music, and scholarship were thriving under the influence of humanist thinking and continental European culture. Henry's paranoid authoritarianism crushed this cultural renaissance almost completely. Universities saw their enrollment drop by 70% during Henry's reign. Artistic production virtually stopped, except for propaganda pieces designed to flatter the king. Scientific research was abandoned because intellectual curiosity was seen as potentially dangerous. England went from being a centre of European learning to being an intellectual backwater that wouldn't recover for decades. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of Henry's legacy was how he fundamentally altered the English understanding of political power. Before Henry, English kings were expected to rule within certain constraints. They had to work with Parliament, respect traditional rights, and follow established legal procedures. Henry systematically destroyed all of these limitations, establishing the precedent that royal will was the only law that mattered. This wasn't just a temporary aberration that died with Henry. The political culture he created, where authority was absolute, where dissent was treason, where power justified any action, became embedded in English governance for generations. The English Civil War, which erupted a century after Henry's death, was directly rooted in conflicts between royal absolutism and traditional rights that Henry had created. The religious damage was equally long-lasting. Henry's break with Rome wasn't motivated by genuine theological conviction or desire for reform. It was purely personal, driven by his need to divorce Catherine of Aragon. But the religious chaos he unleashed tore English society apart for over a century. The constant switching between Protestant and Catholic policies, depending on Henry's personal needs, created a climate of religious terror that made genuine faith almost impossible. People never knew whether their beliefs might suddenly be declared heretical, whether their priest might be executed next week, whether attending church might somehow be used as evidence against them. This religious trauma created lasting divisions in English society that persist in some form even today. The sectarian conflicts that plagued Ireland for centuries, the deep suspicion between different Christian denominations, the association of religious authority with political oppression, all of these can be traced directly back to Henry's manipulation of faith for political purposes, but the psychological damage may have been the worst of all. An entire generation of English people learned to live in constant fear, to suppress their thoughts and feelings, to view authority figures as potential threats rather than protectors. This collective trauma was passed down from parents to children, creating a culture of emotional repression and political passivity that would handicap English society for centuries. Think about the irony here. Henry is often portrayed as the king who made England great, who established English independence and power. But the reality is exactly the opposite. Henry inherited a confident, prosperous, culturally vibrant kingdom and left behind a traumatized, impoverished, intellectually stunted society that would spend the next century recovering from his devastation. The myth of good King Henry wasn't just historical revisionism. It was a necessary psychological defense mechanism for a nation that couldn't bear to acknowledge how thoroughly they had been brutalized by their own monarch. It was easier to believe that Henry had been a great king than to confront the reality that they had lived through one of the most destructive reigns in English history. Even Henry's supposed accomplishments crumble under scrutiny. The English Reformation, which is often cited as his greatest achievement, was actually a disaster that weakened England internationally and created domestic chaos that lasted for generations. The Royal Navy, which Henry supposedly built into a great force, was actually left in ruins by his financial mismanagement and wouldn't become truly powerful until the reign of Elizabeth I. The break with Rome, rather than establishing English independence, actually made England more isolated and vulnerable than it had been before. Instead of being part of a European community of Christian kingdoms, England became a pariah state, constantly threatened by Catholic powers and unable to form stable alliances. But perhaps the most damning evidence of Henry's failure as a king is what happened to his own dynasty. The Tudor line, which should have been his greatest legacy, barely survived his death. His son Edward died young, possibly from the stress of trying to live up to impossible expectations. His daughter Mary's reign was consumed by religious persecution and political instability. Elizabeth, despite her personal success, died childless, ending the Tudor dynasty entirely just 56 years after Henry's death. Even the institutions Henry created to serve his purposes became sources of oppression and corruption. The Court of Star Chamber, established to bypass traditional legal procedures, became a byword for arbitrary justice. The system of royal informants and spies that Henry used to control his subjects created a culture of suspicion and betrayal that poisoned English social relationships. The economic policies Henry pursued to fund his wars and extravagant lifestyle created lasting damage to English society. The dissolution of the monasteries, for example, wasn't just a religious reform. It was the largest theft of charitable resources in English history. The monasteries had provided education, healthcare, and social services to the poor. When Henry seized their lands and wealth for his own use, he created a social welfare crisis that England would struggle with for centuries. So why has history been so kind to Henry VIII? Why do we remember him as a larger-than-life figure rather than the destructive tyrant he actually was? The answer lies in the propaganda machine that began operating immediately after his death and never really stopped. The myth of Henry as a great English king served the political needs of his successors, who needed to legitimize their own power by associating themselves with the supposedly glorious past. Later English governments found it useful to portray Henry as a patriotic king who had stood up to foreign interference, even though the reality was that his policies had weakened England considerably. But perhaps most importantly, acknowledging the full extent of Henry's destructiveness would have required English society to confront some uncomfortable truths about the nature of power, authority, and national identity. It was easier to maintain the fiction of the great king than to admit that England had been ruled by a monster for nearly 4 decades. The real Henry VIII wasn't the charismatic Renaissance prince of popular imagination. He was a deeply damaged, paranoid, and cruel individual whose unchecked power allowed him to inflict unimaginable suffering on millions of people. His legacy isn't one of strength and independence, but of trauma, devastation, and the terrible cost of absolute power in the hands of someone who should never have been trusted with it. As we close this dark chapter of history, it's worth remembering that the story of Henry VIII isn't just about one king who lived 500 years ago. It's a timeless warning about what happens when power becomes concentrated in the hands of individuals who are accountable to no one, who surround themselves with people too terrified to tell them the truth, and who convince themselves that their personal desires justify any amount of cruelty. The horrific final days of Henry VIII were the inevitable conclusion of a life spent choosing power over love, fear over trust, and personal gratification over human decency. They remind us that no amount of power can protect us from our own mortality, and that a life built on the suffering of others ultimately becomes its own form of hell. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's darkest periods. I know it's been a difficult story to hear, it certainly was difficult to research and tell, but I believe there's value in confronting these uncomfortable truths about the past, because they help us understand the present and perhaps avoid repeating the same mistakes. If you found this exploration of Henry's final days as compelling as I did, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned, because next time we'll be diving into another fascinating and disturbing chapter of history that will change how you see the world forever. Until then, sleep well, and remember that even the darkest nights eventually give way to dawn.